There is a chair in London that sat empty for one entire morning, while the most powerful men in England stared at it, and nobody dared to sit down. September 30th, 1399, Westminster Hall. The throne of England stands on a platform draped in cloth of gold, and it has no king in it. The king is alive. He is locked in a room less than a mile away. And the men filling this hall, the bishops, the earls, the merchants of London, packed shoulder to shoulder under the great oak roof, have gathered to do something. No one in this kingdom has a legal word for. Before the day ends, a man will rise from his seat, cross himself, and sit down in that empty chair. The crowd will roar, and for the next 72 years, his family will pay for that one short walk with everything it has. A father who wins a crown and never sleeps again. A son who wins the most famous battle in English history and dies before he can collect the prize. A grandson who loses France, loses England, loses his mind, and dies in a locked room in the Tower of London. The same way this story begins, with a king in a cell and no marks on the body. This is the House of Lancaster. They seized the crown of England in a single autumn. They spent 3 generations trying to prove it belonged to them. Here is how they got it, and here is how it destroyed them. Start with the hall itself, because the hall is the whole story in one building. Westminster Hall was 240 feet long, the largest room in England, maybe the largest in Europe, and the man who built its magnificent new roof was Richard II, King of England, the man currently sitting in a cell in the tower. He had commissioned a ceiling of carved oak angels, and the angels were barely finished when the crowd gathered under them to take his throne away. He built the room. The room repaid him by hosting his removal. Understand what these men were attempting, because they did not have instructions. England had deposed a king once before, 72 years earlier, and that king had at least been replaced by his own son, the natural heir. Blood following blood. Nothing like this had ever been tried. The man about to take the throne was the king's first cousin. He was not the next in line by the strictest reading of descent. There was a boy, the Earl of March, descended from an elder branch of the family, whose claim on paper ran ahead of his. Every lawyer in the hall knew it. So the day had to be built, piece by piece, like a stage set. First came the paperwork. A delegation had visited the tower and returned with a document in which Richard, according to the men who wrote it, cheerfully agreed to give up his crown, admitted he was useless as a king, and even said he wished his cousin to succeed him. Almost no one then or since has believed Richard said any of this cheerfully, and one chronicle, sympathetic to him, describes a very different man in that cell, angry, abandoned, asking to speak and being refused. The document was read to the hall anyway. Then came the charges, 33 articles of accusation, read aloud one by one. A catalogue of tyranny. The king had murdered his uncle. The king had seized land without law. The king had said the laws of England lived in his own mouth. Some of the charges were true. Some were stretched. All of them served one purpose: to turn what was about to happen from a crime into a verdict. And then the hall went quiet, and Henry Bolingbroke stood up. He was 32 years old, stocky, red-bearded, one of the most famous knights in Europe, and he had been, until that spring, an exile with a death sentence on his inheritance. Now he stepped forward, crossed himself, and claimed the throne of England. He made the claim in English. Sit with that detail for a moment, because it is the most American thing in this whole medieval story. For 300 years, since the Norman conquest, the business of English kingship had been conducted in French. French was the language of the court, the law, the crown. English was the language of the ploughman and the dock worker. Henry claimed the crown in the language of the crowd, and he did it on purpose, because the crowd was the only legitimacy he had. The lords were hedging, the lawyers were nervous, the people of London were cheering, and Henry, who understood power the way his rival understood ceremony, went where the cheering was. Even his claim was a masterpiece of careful fog. He did not say the strict bloodline made him king, because it did not. He did not say conquest made him king, because a king by conquest could seize any man's property, and the lords would never accept it. He said, in effect, that he came of the blood of good King Henry III, and that the realm was on the point of being undone by bad government, and that God had sent him to recover it. Descent, necessity, and heaven blended together so no one could quite tell where one argument ended and the next began. It was brilliant. It was also, and every man under those oak angels knew it, brand new. No parliament had ever made a king before. No crowd's roar had ever been part of the formula. The archbishop took Henry by the hand and led him to the empty throne. He sat. The hall shook with noise, and somewhere in the noise, a question was born that would stalk this family for 3 generations, though not one man in the hall could have phrased it yet. If a king who governs badly can be removed by a cousin with an army and a crowd, then what exactly protects the next king, and the one after that? England had just discovered that the throne was a chair, and a chair is a thing that any man strong enough can sit in. Americans feel this problem in their bones, because the entire American constitutional machine was built centuries later by men obsessed with exactly this nightmare. The transfer of power with no rules. What you are watching in Westminster Hall is the nightmare itself. Live. At the moment of its birth. Nobody in England wrote the rule book. They just moved the king and hoped. 2 weeks later, Henry was crowned, anointed with holy oil, seated on the sacred stone. Every box of ceremony checked twice, because a man who comes to the throne sideways needs the ceremony more than a man born to it. The chronicles say that when the crown touched his head, his hair was crawling with lice, and men who hated him passed the detail down the centuries as an omen. Believe the omen or not, the larger omen was sitting in the tower, alive, eating his meals, a deposed and anointed king with years of life left in him, and no kingdom on earth had ever figured out what to do with one of those. To see what Henry had actually won, and what it would cost him, you have to leave London entirely. You have to go north, to a castle with a lake, and meet the family that produced him, because the House of Lancaster did not begin with a throne. It began with something the medieval world considered almost more valuable. It began with land. There was a castle in the English Midlands where the water was part of the architecture, Kenilworth. Its owner had dammed the streams around it until a lake of more than 100 acres wrapped the walls, so that the great red sandstone towers stood up out of their own reflection, and visitors crossed a long causeway over the water, like guests arriving at an island. Inside, the owner had built a great hall, with windows so tall and so filled with glass that chroniclers bothered to write about the light. This was not a fortress that happened to be beautiful. This was a statement made in stone and water. And the statement was simple. The man who lives here answers to almost no one. The man who lived here was John of Gaunt, and for the last 20 years of the 1300s, he was the richest and most powerful private person in England, and possibly in all of Europe. Gaunt was the third surviving son of King Edward III, which put him close to the crown without ever putting him on it, and everything else he had through a marriage. At 19, he wed Blanche of Lancaster, a duke's daughter described by the poet Geoffrey Chaucer, who knew her personally and served in her household, as radiant, and when her father and then her sister died, the whole Lancaster inheritance funneled down to Blanche and her young husband. The scale of it is hard to hold in your head. Land in more than 30 counties, something like 30 castles, revenues that rivaled what the king himself collected from the entire kingdom in a normal year, a private administration of receivers, auditors, and stewards that ran like a state, because it functionally was a state inside the state, with Kenilworth as its lake-wrapped capital. And here is the detail that mattered most, the one that loads the gun for everything that follows. In 1390, the crown granted that this whole empire, the Duchy of Lancaster, would pass to Gaunt's heirs with special protections, held almost like a private kingdom, separate from ordinary royal reach. The men of that world took inheritance more seriously than they took almost anything, more seriously than friendship, sometimes more seriously than faith, because inheritance was the machine that carried a family through time. Touch a great man's inheritance, and you touched every great man's inheritance. Every earl in England understood that rule. One king was going to forget it. Gaunt spent his life being hated and being necessary, usually at the same time. When the old king faded and the boy King Richard came to the throne at 10, Gaunt was the adult in the room, the obvious power behind the government, and the crowds of London despised him for it. In the Great Revolt of 1381, when peasant armies poured into London, they did not burn the king's palace. They burned Gaunt's, the Savoy on the Thames, the finest private house in the kingdom, and they burned it with a discipline that tells you everything about how his name landed. Looters were forbidden. His tapestries were shredded, his furniture smashed, his jewels hammered and thrown in the river, and one man who tried to pocket a silver cup was thrown into the fire along with it. The rioters were not robbing him, they were erasing him. Gaunt himself was safely north that day. His 10-year-old son later remembered being in the Tower of London as the mob closed in. Spared, according to one account, by a hair. That son was Henry Bolingbroke, and while his father managed an empire, the boy built the other kind of capital, the kind you carry in your reputation. He grew into one of the most admired knights in Europe, and this was a real resume, not a courtesy. At the great jousting festival at St. Inglevert, he ran course after course against the most dangerous professional lances in France and walked away with honour. Then he did what ambitious young nobles did when their own kingdom was quiet. He went looking for God's wars. He sailed to the Baltic and campaigned alongside the Teutonic Knights in the crusading wars of the northern forests. He travelled to Jerusalem itself, praying at the holy places, a journey very few English princes ever made. By his early 30s, Henry of Bolingbroke had seen Prussia, Vienna, Venice, and the Holy Sepulchre, spoke the international language of chivalry fluently, and was, by the unsentimental arithmetic of the day, the most complete man of his generation in England. Keep the comparison in the back of your mind. His cousin the king collected recipes, patronized painters, and redesigned court ceremony. Henry collected battle experience, foreign friendships, and prestige. One of them was building an image of kingship. The other was accidentally building the qualifications for it. There is one more thread to pick up at Kenilworth, and it looks like nothing at all when it enters the story. Among the ladies attached to the Lancaster household was the governess of Gaunt's daughters, a knight's widow named Catherine Swynford. Gaunt fell in love with her, kept her as his mistress for years through 2 political marriages, and had 4 children with her. A family born on the wrong side of the blanket and given the name Beaufort. Late in his life, Gaunt stunned everyone by marrying Catherine, scandalizing every duchess in Europe, and the children were declared legitimate by the Pope and by the Crown. Later, a clause was added on the English side, and the clause is a time bomb sitting quietly under this entire story. The Beauforts were legitimate. The amendment said, for every purpose except one. They could inherit anything except the throne. File that away. A bloodline barred from the crown by a single inserted sentence. 86 years from now, at the very end of this story, that barred bloodline will be the only thread the Lancaster cause has left, and a mother descended from it will thread a needle with it that changes the history of the world. By the late 1390s, then, stand back and look at the board. An aging king's son, the richest man in the kingdom, master of a private state, hated by mobs, indispensable to governments, a son in his prime, famous from Lisbon to Jerusalem, heir to all of it, a young king on the throne, childless, image obsessed, watching this family the way a man with one small lamp watches a bonfire next door. Richard II needed no advisor to explain the problem. The Lancasters had land that rivaled his, a following that rivaled his, and a candidate, if it ever came to candidates, more plausible than his. They had everything a royal house needed except the actual crown, and between them and the crown stood nothing but law, custom, and the patience of one very rich family. Richard's answer to that problem, when it finally came, would be the single greatest act of political self-destruction in English history. He decided that, if the House of Lancaster was too big, the solution was to take everything it owned. What he never imagined was that a man can lose his lands, his title, and his country, and still keep the one asset that matters most. People remembered what Henry Bolingbroke was owed, and in England, a debt like that could be collected. September of 1398. A field outside Coventry, and England had come to watch 2 men try to kill each other legally. A judicial duel, the rarest spectacle in the kingdom. Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, had accused Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, of speaking treason, and Mowbray had denied it. And since no court could untangle one duke's word against another's, the case would be settled the old way, by combat. On the theory that God would steer the winning lance, the crowds began arriving days early. Henry had ordered armour from the finest craftsmen in Milan. Grandstands went up. On the morning itself, the 2 dukes rode into the lists in full plate, took their positions at opposite ends of the field, and lowered their visors. The marshals checked the lances, Tens of thousands of people held their breath for the charge, and the king threw down his baton. Richard II, watching from a raised platform, stopped the duel before a single hoofbeat. He made the two armoured men sit and wait, sweating in their steel, for the better part of 2 hours while he consulted his council. Then his decision was read aloud. There would be no combat and no verdict. Mowbray was banished from England for life. Henry, who had done nothing except make an accusation, was banished for 10 years. The crowd that had come for a fight watched their most admired knight sentenced to exile in his saddle, undefeated, unjudged, and unentitled to a single word of appeal. To understand how it came to this, you have to see what these two cousins had been to each other, because they were nearly the same age. They had known each other all their lives, and they had once hidden in the same fortress, waiting to find out if they would live through the night. In 1381, when the peasant armies burned Gaunt's palace and hunted anyone connected to the government, the 14-year-old King Richard and the 14-year-old Henry Bolingbroke were both inside the Tower of London as the mob broke in. Richard rode out to face the rebels, one of the bravest acts of his life. A boy on a horse, talking down an armed multitude. Henry stayed behind and, by one account, survived the mob's sweep of the tower only because a quick-thinking soldier hid him. 2 boys, one terror, and the lesson each took from it split them for life. Richard learned that his person was sacred, that a crowd would kneel to an anointed king even with blades in their hands. Henry learned that survival was a practical matter. Arranged by practical men, they grew into opposites so neat that a novelist would hesitate to invent them. Richard was tall, fair, and beautiful, and he ruled like a man producing a play about monarchy. He invented court rituals no English king had used, sat crowned and silent on a raised throne for hours while the court stood below, and any man his roving eye landed on was required to kneel. He commissioned the first true royal portrait in English history, himself, enthroned, staring straight out of the panel. And he sponsored a cookbook, and he has a fair claim to popularizing an object his countrymen would carry forever after. The handkerchief. None of this made him a fool. It made him a theorist. Richard believed kingship was a sacrament, that the anointing oil changed a man's substance, that the laws of England lived, as he was accused of saying out loud, in his own mouth. A king like that does not bargain with his nobles. He curates them. Henry did bargain. Henry had spent his life in the world. Richard only staged the tournament circuit, the crusade camp, the pilgrim road, and he understood the unwritten contract that actually held England together. A great lord served the crown, and the crown protected the great lord's lands, and loyalty flowed along the channels of that mutual protection. Richard thought majesty was the source of power. Henry knew land was land, and the armed men who came with it, and the reputation that made those men proud to follow you. There was blood between the cousins too, and it was fresh. A decade earlier, a group of great lords had risen against Richard's government, purged his friends, and executed his favourites, and had come, by some accounts, within a whisper of deposing the young king himself. Henry had been among them, one of the junior partners in the revolt. Richard had waited 9 years, smiling, and then, in 1397, he struck. One of the lords who had humiliated him was beheaded. Another, his own uncle, was shipped to Calais and quietly smothered under a featherbed, the king who loved ceremony had learned to kill, and everyone who had ever crossed him began doing arithmetic. Henry Bolingbroke had crossed him. Henry was also, by now, the heir to the largest private fortune in the kingdom, which made him too dangerous to kill and too dangerous to forgive. Then Mowbray, riding beside Henry on a road outside London, leaned over and said the quiet part. "We are about to be destroyed," he told him. "For what we did at Radcot Bridge, it was a warning between old conspirators." Henry reported the conversation, which turned it into a treason case, and the treason case became the duel, and the duel became the baton in the dust at Coventry. Historians still argue about why Henry informed on him. Fear, calculation, or a genuine belief that Mowbray was plotting. What is certain is that Richard saw the gift he had been handed. Two of his old enemies had denounced each other, and the law of the duel let him dispose of both, without a trial that might expose how thin the charges were. Watch the sentencing again with that in mind, because the numbers are the tell. Mowbray, the accused traitor, exile for life. Henry, the accuser, exile for 10 years, softened with warm words about the king's affection for his cousin. Richard even granted Henry letters patent, promising that if his father died during the exile, Henry could receive his inheritance through attorneys. Without coming home, it looked almost generous. It was a receipt. Richard was not resolving a quarrel between two dukes. He was removing the one man in England whose land, fame, and blood made him a rival. And he was doing it with paperwork instead of an axe, because an axe would have raised the whole nobility against him. And paper, Richard believed, raised nothing. Henry sailed for France in October of 1398. Parisian society received the exiled duke like visiting royalty, which in every sense but the technical one, he was. His father, old and sick at Leicester, wrote him letters. His 10-year-old son, Henry of Monmouth, stayed behind in England. And Richard, in a gesture you may read as kindness or as hostage-taking, took the boy into his own royal household and treated him kindly. Remember that boy. He is going to matter more than anyone at Coventry could have guessed. The exile was supposed to be the end of the problem. 10 years is a long time. Kings tempers cool. Estates get managed by attorneys. All Richard had to do was honour his own signature, wait for time to do its work, and the House of Lancaster would fade into a rich, distant, aging grievance. The entire future of England now hung on one question. Could Richard II leave well enough alone? John of Gaunt died on the 3rd of February, 1399, at Leicester Castle, and his son was not there. The most powerful private man England had ever produced went out of the world with his heir 500 miles away, banished, forbidden to cross the sea, even for the funeral. Gaunt's will survives, and it is a strange, haunted document. He asked that his body lie unburied for 40 days. He asked to be laid. When the 40 days had passed, beside Blanche of Lancaster, the wife of his youth, dead nearly 30 years, in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, the old lion had outlived his king brother, his royal father, 2 wives, and his own political era, and at the end, what he wanted was more time above ground, and the woman he had started with. Everything he had built now waited on one man's signature. The Duchy of Lancaster, the 30 castles, the lands in 30 counties, the private state within the state. All of it was Henry's by law, and not just by ordinary law. Richard himself had sealed letters patent months earlier, promising the exile could inherit through attorneys. The paper existed. Europe had watched him sign it. 6 weeks after Gaunt's death, Richard tore it up. In March, the king revoked his own letters, extended Henry's exile from 10 years to life, and confiscated the entire Lancaster inheritance for the crown. The greatest private fortune in English history was simply absorbed, parcelled out in custodies to the king's favourites, folded into the royal accounts. No trial, no charge, no process at all beyond the king's declared pleasure. Richard had spent years telling anyone who would listen that the laws of England lived in his mouth. Now he demonstrated it, and the demonstration was aimed at a man with no army, no lands, and a dead father, an exile whose whole position could be summarized in one line. All Henry Bolingbroke had left was what people owed him and what people thought of him. Richard believed that was nothing. The belief is almost understandable. Exiles were beggars at foreign courts, and history was full of them, dining out on old titles, aging into irrelevance. What Richard failed to run, because he had never in his life had to run it, was the calculation. Every other landed man in England ran instantly. The news of the confiscation travelled to every castle in the kingdom, and in every one of those castles a lord looked at the fire and worked through the same short chain of logic. Bolingbroke held his inheritance by the strongest title in England, blood descent, confirmed by royal letters. The king voided it with a word. Therefore no inheritance in England was safe while this king reigned. Therefore my inheritance is not safe. Property was the deal that held the whole structure together, the thing the crown existed to protect. And Richard had just announced, in the loudest way possible, that the deal was off whenever he said so. He thought he was ruining one man. He was defaulting on the entire nobility at once. And here the king's timing crossed the line from arrogance into something like sleepwalking. That spring, with the confiscation fresh, with the nobility silently seething, Richard assembled an army, boarded ship, and left England altogether. He sailed for Ireland to put down a rebellion, taking with him his household knights, his treasure, and, in his baggage train, young Henry of Monmouth, the exile's son, hostage and honoured guest at once. The king left his kingdom in the care of his uncle Edmund of York, a dishent, tired, unwarlike man, with a scratch force and instructions to hold things together. England, in the summer of 1399, was a country with its army overseas, its regent elderly, its nobility frightened for their deeds and titles, and its most famous soldier sitting in Paris with nothing left to lose. Richard had built the perfect conditions for the thing he feared most, and then he had removed himself from the board. In Paris, Henry moved carefully. The French crown, officially friendly to Richard, would not help him openly, but the politics of the French court shifted that spring in ways that loosened the watch on him, and Henry began to gather the small, hard core of a return, a handful of loyal Lancaster knights, the exiled Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Arundel, a man with his own scores to settle and the moral authority of the English Church in his luggage. A few ships were arranged. The party that finally slipped down to the coast and put to sea in late June numbered, by most accounts, no more than 300 men. 300 to invade a kingdom. The wind that carried them north was carrying one of the great gambles in European history. And it is worth being honest about what Henry did and did not know. He did not know the nobility would rise for him. He did not know his father's old retainers would answer. He had a claim, a grievance every landed man shared, a reputation polished across 20 years and half of Christendom, and a king conveniently absent with the army. Whether that added up to an inheritance recovered or a head on London Bridge, no man alive could have told him. Richard, in Ireland, knew none of it. The king was chasing rebels through bogs, knighting young Henry of Monmouth in the field. By one account, for bravery, master of ceremonies to the end. While behind him, across the water, the price of the theft came due. He had taken everything from his cousin except the things that could not be confiscated. A name, a debt, and, now, a reason. The ships turned toward the Yorkshire coast in the first days of July, 1399. Aboard the lead vessel rode a man who had left England 8 months earlier as a duke with a future, and was returning as something far more dangerous. A wronged heir with nothing to protect. Richard had thought he was stripping an exile of his inheritance. He had handed the exile a kingdom's worth of reasons to come home. The place where the House of Lancaster was born no longer exists. Around the 4th of July, 1399, a handful of ships nosed into the Humber estuary on the Yorkshire coast and put their men ashore at a spot called Ravenspur, a trading port on a spit of sand and shingle. In the centuries since, the North Sea has taken it. The streets, the wharf, the chapel, all of it lies somewhere under grey water today. Fish moving through the ground where a dynasty came ashore. You cannot visit the beach where this story turns. The sea ate it, which feels less like geography and more like a verdict. Henry Bolingbroke came down the gangplank with roughly 300 men, and by one tradition he knelt and kissed the sand. Then he did the single smartest thing of his entire life. He swore an oath, publicly, repeatedly, to anyone who would listen, that he had come for one thing only, the Duchy of Lancaster, the inheritance stolen from him in March. Nothing about the crown, nothing about King Richard. God preserve him. A wronged son wanted his father's lands back, and English law was on his side. And who could quarrel with that? The oath was the key that unlocked England, because it gave every cautious man a safe reason to join him. Backing a usurper was treason and a gamble of everything. Backing an heir, reclaiming stolen property, was practically a civic duty, and it let a lord ride to Henry's camp while telling himself, honestly, that he remained loyal to the king. Watch what the oath now sets in motion. Because the speed is the story. Henry marched inland through his own family's country. Yorkshire, studded with Lancaster castles, whose garrisons opened their gates to the son of John of Gaunt. Old retainers of his father came in with their tenants. In armour their families had carried for generations of Lancaster service. Then came the earthquake. Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, the greatest lord of the north, a man who ruled the Scottish border like a private kingdom, rode into Henry's camp at Doncaster with his son, the most famous young soldier in England, a man so quick to fight that the Scots themselves had nicknamed him Hotspur. The Percys brought the north with them, and at Doncaster, witnesses later swore, Henry repeated his oath on holy relics. The duchy only, not the throne, 300 men became several thousand, then tens of thousands. The regent, old Edmund of York, mustered what troops he could and discovered they had no interest in dying for Richard's paperwork. In late July, the regent met his nephew near Berkeley. After one conversation, essentially joined him. The kingdom had changed hands in 3 weeks, and to that point, barely a man had been killed. Only 2, in fact, died in a way that mattered, and their deaths tell you the revolution had teeth behind its lawyer's smile. At Bristol, the crowd handed over 3 of Richard's most hated officers. The men who had administered the confiscations. Henry had 2 of them beheaded the next morning, without anything a court would recognize as a trial. The heir, who had come only for his inheritance, was already executing the king's ministers. And if anyone in the camp noticed the oath beginning to strain, no one said it aloud. Richard got the news in Ireland, days late. The winds against him. And here, the god of details went to work. Before sailing back, he split his force, sending part ahead under a trusted earl. And when that advance force reached Wales, it dissolved into the general landslide. When Richard himself finally landed in South Wales in late July, he was marching through a country that had already decided. His army melted. Night by night, men slipped away with the horses. Somewhere in those days the king took off his royal robes, dressed himself, the chronicles say, as a poor priest, and rode north through the mountains with a shrinking household, making for the great castle of Conwy, a friar's cloak on the man who had invented the raised throne and the 2-hour silence. What happened at Conwy was the cold centre of the whole revolution. The Earl of Northumberland arrived to negotiate, and swore a solemn oath, on the host, on holy relics, that Richard would remain king, keep his dignity, and merely surrender his worst counsellors, if he would come out and talk. Richard came out, on the road, at a bend beneath a rock. An armed force was waiting, and the King of England was taken like a parcel. He rode to Flint Castle between guards. And there, in the courtyard, the 2 cousins who had once hidden in the tower as boys faced each other for the first time since the baton fell at Coventry. Both men were polite. Chronicles preserve the exchange in different words, and in all of them, Henry says, some version of the same thing. I have come back, he says, to help you govern the kingdom, which you have governed badly. And Richard answers, in words that taste of ash, if it pleases you, fair cousin, then it pleases us well. Somewhere between the sand at Ravenspur and the courtyard at Flint, the oath had quietly died, and the honest answer to when is that no one knows. Perhaps not even Henry. There is no evidence he sailed from France with a plan for the crown. And the most convincing reading of that summer is also the most human one. Each step made the next step logical, and no step offered a way back. A man who has raised the kingdom, beheaded royal ministers, and taken the anointed king prisoner cannot hand Richard the sceptre, accept his duchy, and go home to Kenilworth to wait for the knock on the door. By the time the column turned toward London, with Richard riding in it as luggage, there were only 2 possible endings: Henry's coronation or Henry's execution, and every man in that column knew which one he was riding toward. They gave Richard to the Tower at the start of September. Then came the paperwork you have already watched. The resignation extracted in a cell, the 33 articles, the careful fog of dissent and necessity and heaven. On the 30th of September, the lords, the bishops and the roaring commons of London packed into Westminster Hall, under the carved angels Richard had paid for, and stared at an empty throne, and a stocky red-bearded man rose, crossed himself, and sat down in it. That is the scene this story opened with, and now you know everything standing behind it. The lake at Kenilworth, the claws protecting the Beauforts from everything except the throne, the baton in the dust at Coventry, the signature torn up in March, the oath sworn on the sand at a port the sea has since swallowed. It took 90 days to walk from that beach to that chair, and the walk looked, from the outside, almost effortless. The next 14 years would be the invoice. Pontefract Castle. In the winter dark of early 1400, somewhere in its inner towers, behind a door that opened only for jailers, sat a 33-year-old man who had been, 4 months earlier, the anointed King of England. The new government had moved him north in secret, by night, in plain clothes. "There is a report," he asked, at the handover, to be told where he was being taken, and was refused. The man who had once required earls to kneel at a glance from his throne could no longer get an answer to a question about his own location. Henry IV had inherited the oldest problem in the deposition business, the problem no kingdom had ever solved cleanly. A living ex-king is a flag. It does not matter what he wants, what he signs, or how quietly he behaves. His existence is a standing invitation, because every man with a grievance against the new reign now has a cause with a face, and an anointed face at that. Parliament had debated what to do with Richard, and settled on perpetual, secret imprisonment, keep the flag in a box, and hope. The hope lasted less than 4 months. At Christmas, a group of Richard's loyalists, earls he had raised up, and Henry had demoted, met at Westminster Abbey and built a plot with a simple shape. The new king and his 4 sons would be at Windsor for the Epiphany feast, the great holiday of gift-giving, celebrated with masks and disguisings. Men in costume moving freely through a relaxed royal household. The conspirators would arrive as part of the entertainment, armed under the costumes, kill Henry and all 4 boys in one night, and bring Richard out of Pontefract and back to the throne. It came terrifyingly close to working. The plot was betrayed at the last moment. By most accounts, through one of the plotters losing his nerve, and Henry got his sons out of Windsor hours ahead of the swords. What followed settled any doubt about the country's mood, and it did not flatter the old regime. Town mobs, not royal armies, finished most of the rebel earls. The men of Cirencester took 2 of them out of an inn and beheaded them in the marketplace. London hunted another. The heads came to the capital in baskets. And Henry, watching the kingdom defend his family with axes before his own troops could arrive, could be forgiven for thinking the new reign had passed its first test. But every man in the government understood what the Epiphany Rising had actually proven. The plot had a heart, and the heart was alive in Pontefract. As long as Richard breathed, there would be another Christmas, another disguising, another set of earls with swords under their costumes. No order survives, no instruction, no letter, no minute of any council. All that survives is the timing, and the timing speaks with a clarity no document could match. Within weeks of the rising, Richard of Bordeaux stopped being fed. The best evidence, and the belief of most historians since, is that he was simply starved. Meal by withheld, meal in the silence of a Yorkshire winter, a process chosen with hideous care. Starvation leaves no wound. Starvation can be called natural. Starvation gives the man who ordered it, if any man ordered it at all, a corpse he can display, and display it he did. By March, the body of Richard II was travelling south in an open coffin, the face exposed from the brow to the chin, shown at every major stop so the country could see for itself. No gash, no brise, no rope mark. A king who had, the government's silence implied, sorrowed himself to death. Thousands filed past it in St. Paul's. Then, and the pettiness of this detail is its own confession, the anointed king was buried at an out-of-the-way friary at King's Langley, nowhere near the magnificent tomb Richard had built for himself in Westminster Abbey beside his beloved first queen. Henry could put the body on tour, putting it in the grave Richard had prepared. In the abbey, where kings were made, was more legitimacy than the new reign could spare. Notice what Henry had learned, or rather, what he had established, because the lesson outlived him. An anointed king cannot be tried, and cannot be openly executed, because the axe that falls on one crowned head has a way of staying sharp for the next. But a deposed king can die of nothing, behind stone, at a convenient hour, with no marks and no orders and no witnesses, and the government need only manage the silence afterward. Hold on to that formula. It is the original sin of this house. The patent Lancaster, filed in the winter of 1400, and patents can be used by anyone. 71 years from now, in another locked room, in another tower, the formula will be run one more time, step for step, on the last king of this family, by men who learned it from this exact winter. The strangest part came after the funeral. Richard refused to stay dead. Within a couple of years, a rumour was moving through England and Scotland that the corpse in the coffin had been a look-alike, a chaplain who resembled the king, and that Richard himself had escaped Pontefract and was alive in Scotland, waiting. A man surfaced north of the border whom the Scots maintained, for years, was the true Richard II, and never mind that observers described him as wandering in his wits. Rebels rose in his name. Priests were executed for preaching his survival. Letters moved. For a decade and more, the ghost of Richard did real political work, pinning garrisons, feeding conspiracies, whispering in every disaffected hall in the kingdom. Henry had solved the problem of the living king and discovered the problem underneath it, which no jailer could reach. You can starve a man. Starving a story is harder. So take the measure of what the new king had actually won. One winter, into the reign he had walked into, almost without resistance, he held the crown, the duchy, and the government. Against that, an anointed predecessor dead in his custody, with every fingerprint wiped, but everyone certain whose hand had moved. A church and nobility who had swallowed the deposition on the argument of good government, and who would now grade his government against that promise forever. A ghost in Scotland, and a question, still unphrased but no longer avoidable, sitting where the oath at Ravenspur used to be. He had removed the man. The question was not removable, and it had already begun to collect. The invoice arrived almost immediately, from a direction nobody at Westminster was watching, and it was carried by a Welsh landowner in his 50s with grey in his beard, a law student's past, and a grievance about a strip of pasture. Within a year his name would be shouted from one end of Wales to the other. And Henry IV, the most complete soldier of his generation, would spend the rest of his health failing to catch him. Picture the new king at night, in his palace at Eltham, a few years into the reign he had walked into so easily. The household is asleep. Henry is not. He is sitting with the reports, and the reports never stop coming, and every one of them is a variation on the same message. Something else is on fire. He had taken the crown on a promise of good government, and good government, it turned out, was a landlord's job performed under siege. The Scots probed the border. French raiders burned along the south coast, testing whether the usurper could protect his own shoreline. The ghost of Richard walked through every disaffected county, and priests kept being arrested for announcing that the true king was alive in Scotland and coming home. And then there was Wales, which deserves its own paragraph, because Wales became the wound that would not close. It began, and this is the part you could not invent, with a property dispute. A Welsh landowner in his 50s, named Owain Glyndwr, prosperous, educated, trained in the law courts of Westminster, a man who had served in English armies and lived half his life inside the English system, had a quarrel with his neighbour, Lord Grey, over a strip of common land. The courts, stacked toward the English lord, gave him nothing. In September of 1400, Glyndwr's frustration and his country's found each other, and a crowd of his followers proclaimed him Prince of Wales, the title reserved for the heir to the English throne. What followed was not a battle, because Glyndwr was too intelligent to offer one. It was a fire in the hills. Ambush and vanish. Burn and vanish. A war fought by weather and terrain against an occupier who could win every field engagement and still lose the country. 3 separate times Henry marched royal armies into Wales, and 3 separate times the mountains defeated him without a fight. Rain that rotted the supply wagons. Floods. Snow in September. Storms so freakish that English soldiers began telling each other, in complete seriousness, that Glyndwr was a magician who commanded the sky. The king's tent was torn down on top of him one night in a gale, and he survived, the story goes, only because he had gone to sleep in his armour. A king who sleeps in his armour inside his own kingdom. Hold that image, because it is the reign in one line. All of it cost money, and money was the second siege, the quieter one, and in the long run, the more dangerous. War on 3 fronts drained the treasury, and when Henry turned to Parliament for taxes, he discovered the true price of the way he had come to the throne. He had claimed the crown on the argument that Richard governed badly and seized property lawlessly. Very well, said the Commons, in session after session. With increasing boldness, we will grade your government, and we will see accounts before we grant money. They demanded to audit royal spending. They named councillors they wanted removed, and got it. No English king had ever been haggled with like this. And Henry, swallowing his fury, haggled, because a king who owes his throne to consent cannot rule as if consent does not matter. He was learning, year by year. The first Lancaster answer to the question of legitimacy: wrap the stolen crown in law, govern through Parliament, keep the paperwork clean, be the constitutional king. Richard refused to be. It was honest, grinding work, and it bought him survival, and it satisfied absolutely no one, least of all the men who had put him on the throne and now presented their invoice. The Percys, the family that had brought the north to Doncaster, the family whose word had unlocked the kingdom, expected to be paid like the kingmakers they were, and the arithmetic went wrong almost immediately. They held the Scottish border for the crown, and the crown, being broke, paid them late and short, while they advanced their own money to keep the garrisons fed, and the invoices piled up unanswered. Then came the insults, and the insults were sharper than the debts. In the autumn of 1402, Hotspur smashed a Scottish army at Homildon Hill and took a haul of noble prisoners whose ransoms were worth a fortune. The customary right of the captor, Henry, desperate for leverage and cash, demanded the prisoners for the crown. Around the same time, Hotspur's brother-in-law, Edmund Mortimer, was captured by Glyndwr in battle, and Henry refused to allow his ransom at all. Look at the refusal from Henry's chair, and you can see the cold logic. Mortimer was the uncle of that boy, Earl of March, the child whose bloodline ran, by the strictest count, ahead of Henry's own. Ransoming him meant restoring a rival claim to the board. So Mortimer rotted in Wales, until he solved the problem himself. He married Glyndwr's daughter and joined the rebellion. And now the Welsh fire had a Mortimer attached to it, and the Percys had a grievance with royal blood in it. In July of 1403, the invoice came due all at once. Hotspur raised his banner in Cheshire, Richard's old heartland, and the manifesto that spread with him aimed a knife directly at the heart of the reign. Henry of Lancaster, it declared, had perjured himself at Doncaster, sworn on the relics that he came only for his duchy, and stolen a crown. Everything the king had spent 4 years trying to bury with law and parliaments was suddenly shouted from horseback in the open air. Hotspur marched to join Glyndwr, and between the two of them, on the map, sat one town, Shrewsbury, garrisoned by the king's eldest son, 16 years old, named Henry like his father. The king got the news and moved faster than he had moved since Ravenspur, force marching to reach Shrewsbury before Hotspur could take the town or the boy inside it. He arrived with hours to spare. On the 21st of July, 1403, outside Shrewsbury, an English royal army formed up against an English rebel army. Longbowmen, on both sides, for the first time in the nation's history, and fathers and sons who had fought together in Scotland sorted themselves onto opposite ends of the same field. 4 years after a nearly bloodless revolution, England was about to find out what the revolution actually cost, and the man who had sworn the oath and the boy who carried his name would both be standing in the arrow storm when it did. The first arrow volleys at Shrewsbury did something no living Englishman had seen. They fell on Englishmen. For a generation, the longbow had been the national weapon, the thing that made small English armies lethal to enormous foreign ones. And its terror had always pointed outward. Now 2 English lines loosed at each other at once. And the sky, one chronicler wrote, darkened like a cloud of starlings, and men went down in rows on both sides. Before anyone had swung a sword, the king's vanguard broke and ran under it. Veterans said, afterward, there had never been such shooting on English soil. There had never been English shooting at English, which is the same sentence, arranged differently. In the royal line, commanding the left wing, stood the Prince of Wales, 16 years old. Somewhere in the opening storm, an arrow came off a rebel bow, cleared his raised visor, and struck him in the face, entering beside his nose, below the left eye. The shaft was pulled out, or snapped off. The bodkin head stayed, buried 6 inches deep in the bone of his skull. A hand's width of iron sitting behind a teenager's face. His officers told him to leave the field. He refused. And the refusal was not bravado. It was arithmetic, spoken out loud. By one account he said that if the prince ran, the army ran, and he stayed in the line, bleeding under his helmet, and led his wing through the rest of the battle, wheeling it into the rebel flank in the maneuver that helped break the day. The battle itself was short, savage, and decided by a detail. Hotspur, the most famous soldier in England, did what he had done his whole life, gathered his best men and charged directly at the royal standard to end the war with one death. He cut deep, close enough that the king's standard-bearer was killed, and somewhere in that melee, Hotspur raised his visor, for air, for sight, for a moment, and an arrow found the opening, and the rebellion died with him on its feet. The cry went up, "Harry Percy is dead," and his army came apart in the dusk. The king wept over the body, by one account, and then had it quartered anyway. The head sent north to be spiked on the gates of York, because grief was a luxury and proof was a necessity. The message of the display was addressed to every hall in England. The Oathbreaker king was still standing, and this is the price of testing him. Now follow the prince off the field, because what happened next belongs in the history of medicine as much as the history of England. The wound should have killed him, if not on the day, then in the week, when infection did what infection did to face wounds in an age without antiseptics. The court surgeons tried and failed to draw the arrowhead. Then a London surgeon named John Bradmore was brought to Kenilworth, where the boy lay, and Bradmore, who left us his own written account, went to work like an engineer. He widened the wound channel gradually, using probes wrapped in clean linen and soaked in honey, enlarging the opening a little more each day. And the honey was not folklore. It is a natural antiseptic, and the modern reader watches a medieval man reason his way to it with a kind of awe. Then he built a tool for the job, a slender iron instrument with a threaded screw at its tip, designed to reach down the channel, thread itself into the socket of the buried arrowhead, and greep days of dilation. Then the instrument goes in, 6 inches into the skull of a conscious 16-year-old. The screw bites, and Bradmore wrote the ending in one working craftsman's sentence. He drew the arrowhead out. Thanks be to God. He washed the wound with white wine and packed it with honey. And in 3 weeks the future Henry V was healing. The boy carried the scar beside his nose for the rest of his life. And here is the small detail that opens onto the whole man. The one authentic portrait type of Henry V, copied and recopied for centuries, shows him, in strict profile, the only major English royal portrait of its era painted side on. Kings faced the viewer. Henry shows you the undamaged half. Whether he ordered it or his image makers simply understood him, the choice tells you what Shrewsbury left behind. A ruler who had learned by 17 that a king's face is a public building, and that what the public sees is a decision. The years after Shrewsbury were the apprenticeship, and they were long, unglamorous, and priceless. The rebellion was broken, but the war was not, and the prince went back to Wales and spent his late teens and early 20s grinding glindras rising down the slow way, siege by siege, garrison by garrison, Payroll by payroll. Forget the tavern prince of the later legend for a moment, because the record of these years shows something less entertaining and far more formidable. A young man learning war as management. He begged the council for money in letter after letter, pawned his own jewels to pay archers, learned what a garrison eats in a winter and what happens when it does not get it, learned gunpowder artillery at the sieges of Welsh castles, learned patience. Glyndwr was never captured and never surrendered, fading at last into the mountains and into legend. But his rebellion starved to death against the system the prince built, and by his mid-20s, Henry of Monmouth had done something his famous father never quite managed. He had ended a war. His father, meanwhile, was losing the war inside his own body. In the spring of 1405, a rebellion in the north ended with something that shocked even hardened men. The king executing the Archbishop of York, Richard Scrope, who had joined the rebels. No English king had ever put an archbishop to judicial death, days after the axe fell. So the story spread. The king was struck down with a burning disease of the skin, and he spent the rest of his life in intermittent collapse, disfigured by an affliction his enemies gleefully and his subjects quietly called leprosy. God's own verdict, written on the flesh of the man who killed an archbishop and starved a king. Honesty requires the same discipline here, as always. No one knows what the disease was, and the diagnosis of heaven is not available to historians. What can be said is that England believed it, that the king himself, in the black hours, seems half to have believed it, and that the belief did political work, because a usurper's body failing in public looked less like medicine and more like a sentence being carried out. So the reign entered its last act with a strange and combustible geometry. A father, prematurely old, scarred, exhausted, guarding with failing hands the crown he had paid his conscience for. A son, healed, hardened, proven at Shrewsbury and in Wales, watching the government drift and believing, with the terrible confidence of a man in his 20s who has been, right before, that he could run it better. The father had seized the crown by breaking every rule. The son intended to keep it by becoming the rule. 2 Henrys, 1 throne, and between them a question neither could say out loud, because the last time an heir grew impatient with a failing king in England, the heir had been Henry IV. Henry IV had one dream left, and it was the strangest one available to a dying usurper. He wanted to lead a crusade. The man who could barely ride the length of his own kingdom talked seriously, in his last years, about taking the cross and marching to the Holy Land. And somewhere in those years, a prophecy attached itself to him. The kind of prophecy medieval kings collected like weather. It had been foretold. Men said that Henry would die in Jerusalem. He seems to have taken real comfort in it. A man who dies in Jerusalem dies on crusade. Redeemed, his sins burned off in service. And no king in Europe had a heavier file of sins waiting for review. A stolen crown, a starved cousin, a beheaded archbishop. Jerusalem was the plan for settling the account. The account had other ideas. By 1412, the king was a wreck at 45, collapsing in public, disfigured, sometimes unable to walk, once so still that his attendants believed him dead and covered his face. The government drifted, and into the drift stepped the Prince of Wales, and the last years of the reign became a cold war between the king's sickroom and the prince's ambition. The prince and his allies dominated the royal council for a stretch and ran the war policy, the king rallying threw the prince's faction out. The prince arrived in London with an armed following large enough to make the capital nervous, demanding, depending on whose account you read, his place back, or something closer to his father's abdication. Slander reached the sick king that his son wanted the crown before the funeral, and the terrible thing about the slander was how plausible everyone found it. This family had form. One story from those years survives in several versions, and whether or not every detail happened, the men of that generation believed it happened, which tells you what they understood about this father and this son. The prince, the story goes, came to his father to answer the whispers, and to prove his loyalty he came strangely dressed, and he knelt before the sick king, offered him a dagger, and invited Henry to kill him then and there if he believed his son a traitor. The king wept, embraced the boy, and confessed he had doubted him. Reconciliation, in this house, was performed with a blade in the room. In March of 1413, the end arrived with the sense of stagecraft. This story cannot seem to escape. The king came to Westminster Abbey to pray at the shrine of Edward the Confessor, England's royal saint. Possibly, in preparation for the crusade he still spoke of. At the shrine he collapsed. His attendants gathered him up, and they carried him to the nearest warm room in the abbot's lodgings, a chamber with a fire going. As he came back to consciousness, he asked where he was. The room, they told him, was called the Jerusalem Chamber. The prophecy walked into the room and closed the door. Henry understood at once, by the account that survives, and accepted it. He would die in Jerusalem after all. And heaven, it turned out, had been running a wordplay, and the crusade was cancelled, and the sins would have to stand as filed. He lingered days, and in those days, one more scene, the most famous of the reign, and the chronicles differ on its details, which is worth saying plainly, because the scene is almost too perfect. The king lay unconscious, the crown, by custom, resting on a cushion beside the bed. The watchers, at some point, believed he had stopped breathing, and the prince, told his father was dead, took the crown and carried it out of the room. Then the king woke. He asked where the crown had gone, and the prince was called back, and the dying man asked his son what right he had to take it. Since God knew, he said, what shaky right he himself had ever had to it, and the prince answered, in the version England chose to remember, that his father had kept it with the sword, and with the sword he would keep it too. You could spend a year unpacking that exchange and not exhaust it. The father, at the very end, saying out loud the thing he had never once admitted from the throne, that his own title had been doubtful all along. The son, answering with the only argument the family actually possessed once the lawyers went home, possession, held by force, made good by performance. It was an honest answer, and it was a terrifying one, because it conceded the entire question of 1399. If the sword is the title, then the title belongs to whoever wins. Henry IV died on the 20th of March, 1413, in the Jerusalem Chamber, 45 years old, worn through like a man of 70. Weigh him fairly, because the next reign is going to blaze so brightly that this one always ends up in its shadow. He took a throne almost without blood, held it for 14 years against rebellion, magic weather, bankruptcy, and his own rotting body, and he handed it on, intact, to his son, which is the one thing a founder absolutely must do, and the thing most usurpers fail to do. He also never enjoyed a single peaceful year of it. He came for an inheritance and got an invoice, and he paid it in sleep, in health, in old friends executed, and in the knowledge, which he carried to the grave, that no victory had ever quite answered the question he sat on. Law had not answered it. Parliaments had not answered it. 14 years of careful, grinding, constitutional government had not answered it. His son had watched all 14 of those years, and had drawn his own conclusion, and the conclusion was already visible in the answer he gave across his father's deathbed. You do not argue a stolen crown into legitimacy. You make it shine until no one remembers to ask. It snowed at the coronation. On the 9th of April, 1413, Passion Sunday, a spring blizzard came down on London as Henry V rode to Westminster to be crowned. Snow thick enough that the chroniclers logged it, and the whole city argued about what it meant. Some said it foretold a cold, hard rain. Others said the snow was the winter of the old rain passing, purity falling on a fresh start. Both readings turned out to be correct, which is the way with good omens. The new king was 26, and the men who knew him began reporting, almost immediately, the same strange thing. He had changed overnight, and the change held. The prince had been a formidable soldier with a young man's appetites and a faction leader's sharp elbows. The king who walked out of the coronation was something else. Austerer, controlled, precise. A man who had apparently decided that Henry of Monmouth was a costume he no longer needed. The Tudor stage would later inflate this into the wild tavern prince reborn as a saint in a single scene. And the inflation worked because it was anchored to something real. People who met the new king used the same words again and again. Grave, just, terrifyingly focused. He heard petitions personally, worked through the accounts line by line, and drank, by several reports, almost nothing. England had been governed for a decade by a dying man's intervals. It was now governed by a machine that never seemed to sleep, and the machine had plans. Watch the first moves, because each one is aimed, with a marksman's economy, at a different wound of the House of Lancaster. He ordered the body of Richard II dug up from its obscure grave at King's Langley and reburied in Westminster Abbey, in the magnificent tomb Richard had built for himself, beside the Queen he had loved, with full royal honours. The new king, walking as chief mourner, stop and admire the cold brilliance of it. Henry V had been the last king's ward, had been knighted by him in Ireland, and owed him, by the standards of the age, a debt of the heart. The reburial paid that debt in public, and it did something far more valuable at the same time. It closed the file. A murdered king, hidden in a friary, is an open wound and a rallying cry. A king, honoured in the abbey among his ancestors, is history, mourned, resolved, and safely dead. The son of the man who almost certainly ordered Richard starved now presided over Richard's apotheosis, and by doing so, quietly reframed the whole ugly business as a tragedy the new generation had risen above. The ghost that had walked for 13 years was, at last, buried by the one man with the standing to bury it. He proclaimed English, his subjects' own tongue, into royal correspondence. the first king since the conquest, to make the language of the ploughman the language of the crown's own letters. And if you remember his father claiming the throne in English in Westminster Hall, you can see the family instinct maturing into policy. He extended pardons to the heirs of old enemies, restored the young Earl of March, the rival claimant, to full favour, and generally behaved like a man wiping the ledger of every feud his father's seizure had opened. Justice, order, unity. The performance was superb. And it was a performance with a purpose. Because all of it, the reburial, the pardon, the reconciliation, was clearing the decks for the real project, France. The oldest claim in the English royal attic, the argument that the kings of England were, through descent, the rightful kings of France, had gathered dust for a generation while England fought itself. Henry took it down, polished it, and aimed his entire reign at it. And the timing was not an accident, because France in 1413 was a kingdom having a nervous breakdown. Its king, Charles VI, suffered episodes of madness that had gone on for 20 years, intervals in which he failed to recognize his own wife, and, in the detail that all of Europe repeated in fascinated horror, periods in which he believed his body was made of glass, and had iron rods sewn into his clothing, and screamed if anyone touched him, certain he would shatter. Around this poor, shattered man, two great princely factions, Burgundians and Armagnacs, had turned French politics into a blood feud, complete with an assassinated duke and street massacres in Paris. France was the richest kingdom in Christendom, and it was lying in the road. Be honest about the mixture in Henry's mind, because single motive explanations always lie. The legal claim was real to him, pursued through embassies and negotiations that were genuine even when they were theatre. The opportunity was real, and a man of his generation would have called seizing it statecraft. And underneath both ran the family arithmetic, never written down, because it never needed to be. A war for France would take the most dangerous men in England. The board, armed, faction-prone nobility that had spent 20 years fighting each other, and point them all in the same direction. Outward, victory would drape the House of Lancaster in the one robe no lawyer could unpick. God's own verdict, delivered on the battlefield, in public, before all of Europe. His father had tried to answer the question of 1399 with parliaments. Henry would answer it with France. Through the winter of 1414 into 15, the great machine turned toward war. Parliament, swept up, granted taxes on a scale his father had begged for in vain. Fletchers turned out arrows by the 100,000, and the Crown's agents swept the counties for bows. Wagons, salted meat, gunpowder, in the ports. An invasion fleet assembled, hundreds of vessels, the largest English force sent abroad in living memory. And to man, it came the indentured retinues of the nobility and something else. Thousands upon thousands of yeoman archers, the ploughmen and craftsmen whose national weapon was about to meet its hour. Then, at the very edge of departure, the family curse cleared its throat. At Southampton, in the first days of August 1415, with the fleet loaded and the wind almost fair, a plot was uncovered inside the king's own circle. A handful of trusted men, one of them a friend since boyhood, conspiring to proclaim the Earl of March king in Henry's place. The plot was betrayed to Henry by the Earl of March himself, the very man it meant to crown. The conspirators were tried at speed and beheaded within days, and the fleet's departure barely slipped, but every man in the expedition understood what had just been demonstrated. 16 years of law, reburials, pardon, and shining government, and the question of 1399 was still alive enough to organize a coup on the dock. Henry sailed for France in August of 1415, carrying 11,000 men, a legal claim, and a theory that somewhere across that water was a victory large enough to finally silence the question. What waited across the water, 10 weeks ahead, was a muddy field, a sick and starving army, odds that no sane commander would accept, and the single most famous day in English military history. The Great Invasion began by beating itself half to death against one town. Harfleur, a fortified port at the mouth of the Seine, was supposed to fall in days. It held for 5 weeks, and while Henry's cannon pounded the walls, something older than cannon got into the English camp. The army was dug in on marshy ground in a hot September, thousands of men drinking bad water, eating shellfish out of the estuary mud, and dysentery went through the siege lines like a fire through a hayloft. It killed more Englishmen than the French would ever kill on this campaign. It killed a bishop and an earl. It emptied whole companies, and by the time Harfleur finally opened its gates, the conquering army was a hospital. Henry shipped thousands of the sick home, garrisoned his one captured town, and looked at what remained, roughly 6,000 men fit to march, most of them archers, at the far end of Europe. With autumn coming down, every sensible voice in the council said the same thing. Get on the ships, sail home, bank the capture of Harfleur, call it a start, come back next year. And Henry said no, and the no is the whole man. He would march overland to Calais. The English held port 150 miles up the coast, straight through Normandy and Picardy, in front of everyone. Understand what the march was for, because it had no military object at all. Calais could be reached by sea. The march was an argument. A king who claimed to be the rightful lord of this country would walk across it, daring its armies to stop him, because a claim you do not dare to walk on is not a claim. He was betting 6,000 sick men on a legal theory, and for 1 week the bet looked merely reckless. And then it looked fatal. The French had found their answer to 20 years of civil war, and the answer was Henry, Burgundians and Armagnacs, men who had been assassinating each other since before the invasion, agreed on nothing except that the English army trapped on the wrong side of the river Somme was a gift from heaven, and the chivalry of France began assembling to collect it. Every crossing of the Somme was held against Henry. The English trudged inland, day after day, looking for a ford, rations gone, reduced to nuts, and whatever villages yielded, men with dysentery marching, in the blunt testimony of the sources, with their hose cut away, fouled and freezing and still carrying their bows. By the time they finally slipped across the river and turned north again, they had marched 260 miles in 17 days, and the French army was no longer behind them. It was ahead of them, across the road to Calais, and it was enormous. How enormous is a question historians still argue in books with footnotes at war with each other, and the honest answer is a range. The wilder chronicle numbers: 100,000, 150,000, are medieval poetry. Modern scholars put the French somewhere between 12 and 36,000 against Henry's roughly 6,000. And even the low reading means the English were badly outnumbered, exhausted, sick, and starving, facing fresh troops who had been eating properly for weeks. On the evening of the 24th of October, 1415, the English came over a rise near a castle called Agincourt and saw the French host spread across the fields ahead. Fires beyond counting. And every man in the column understood that the argument would be settled tomorrow. On ground, the French had chosen to be caught on. Then it rained, all night, cold and steady, on a landscape of freshly ploughed farmland, and the two armies passed the same night in ways so different that the chroniclers on both sides recorded the contrast in something like wonder. The French camp blazed and roared. Wine, music, servants, tens of thousands of confident men, and the nobles, by the famous account, diced through the night for shares in the prisoners they would take at dawn. The King of England's person the grand prize on the board. Ransom was the business model of chivalric war, and tomorrow was payday. The English camp was nearly silent, and the silence was an order. Henry had commanded quiet on pain of severe punishment, and so 6,000 men whispered, confessed to the priests in the dark, checked bowstrings under whatever cover they could find, and tried to sleep in the rain. Many assumed they would die in the morning. The king walked the camp. There is testimony he moved among his men that night, plainly visible, and whatever he said, no man wrote it down verbatim, and into that silence. 2 centuries later, Shakespeare would pour the most famous military speech in the English language, a fictional band of brothers, so potent that 400 years further on, an American television epic about paratroopers in Normandy, a few days' march from this field, would take it for a title, and coaches in American locker rooms would quote it before games without knowing they were quoting a playwright, guessing at a whisper in the rain. Now look closely at who was actually standing in that rain, because this is the part of Agincourt that belongs to you. 5 of every 6 men in the English line were archers, and the archers were not gentlemen. They were ploughmen, carters, blacksmiths, shepherds, tanners' sons from villages in Wales and the English shires, men legally required since boyhood to practice with the longbow every Sunday on the village green, until years of it deformed their skeletons, thickened their left arms and twisted their spines. Working men reshaped by their weapon. Across the field stood the flower of France. Dukes, counts, knights, men whose armour cost more than an archer's village earned in a decade. Men bred through 20 generations to believe that war belonged to them because God had arranged the world in ranks. Tomorrow morning, the ranked world was going to charge the working world across 800 yards of mud, and the working world was going to shoot it down at 2 pence a day. Americans do not need this explained. It is the oldest story in the national bloodstream. The aristocracy of birth walking into the aristocracy of practice, and practice winning. One more thing before dawn. Mark how this miracle is built, piece by piece, because you will need the list later. A freakish weather event the night before. A narrow field between 2 woods. Exhausted commoners with longbows against confident noblemen in plate. Arrows in impossible numbers. And mud deciding who could move and who could not. Fix the recipe in your mind. 46 years from now, this story will cook it one more time every ingredient in place, in snow instead of rain, and it will be served to the house of Lancaster with the plate turned around. Morning came up grey on the 25th of October, St. Crispin's Day, and for 4 hours nothing happened. The two armies stood and looked at each other across a half-mile of ploughed mud, and the standoff was itself a battle, because time fought for France. The French had food, numbers, and reinforcements still arriving. Henry had 6,000 hungry men getting hungrier. So, somewhere before midday, the King of England did the thing military logic screamed against, the thing that won the battle before an arrow flew. He ordered his whole line to pull up its defensive stakes, advance across the field, and replant them within bowshot of the French army, close enough that his archers could reach the enemy mass, close enough that the enemy could no longer decline to fight without shame. It was a crawl across open ground that an alert opponent could have destroyed with one cavalry charge. The charge never came. The French, packed, overconfident, quarrelling over precedence in the front line, watched the English walk 400 yards, hammer their stakes, and draw. Then the arrow started, and the world's most professional army was introduced to physics. Begin with the ground, because the ground did as much killing as the steel. A field sown with winter wheat, ploughed soft, then rained on all night, then churned by thousands of hooves and feet, became something between glue and quicksand. A knight's full harness ran to 50 or 60 pounds, beautifully balanced for a man on firm footing, murderous on a man wading in mud over his ankles, then his shins, then, in places, his knees. The French cavalry charge against the English flanks, when it finally came, broke against the stakes and the arrow storm, and the wounded horses did the rest, bolting back, riderless and maddened through the advancing French infantry, ploughing lanes of chaos through their own side, and the great mass of French men at arms, thousands of the best armoured soldiers on earth, walked forward into the funnel, because a funnel is what the field was, woods on both flanks, squeezing the frontage tighter as they advanced, so that the widest army compressed itself as it moved, rank pressing into rank, men shoved from behind into men slowing in front. The arrow storm poured into that compression at a rate almost beyond imagining. Thousands of shafts a second across the line at peak, and the physics here deserve one honest sentence. The best French plate could stop most arrows at distance, and the arrows did not need to pierce every breastplate. They killed horses, found visors and armpits and thighs, and above all, they forced thousands of men to duck their heads, close their vents, and keep walking blind through falling iron in sucking mud, arriving at the English line, exhausted, half smothered, and packed too tight to swing. When the lines met, the fighting was ferocious, and the front of the French mass went down, and the men behind, still shoved forward by the thousands behind them, tripped over the fallen, and the fallen began to pile. The chronicles on both sides. This is not English boasting. Describe heaps of armoured men, the height of a man, and inside those heaps, men who had never been touched by a blade were drowning, pressed face down into mud and into each other under the weight of their own army. More Frenchmen may have suffocated at Agincourt than were killed by any weapon, and the archers put down their bows, out of arrows, watching the wall of steel flounder. The ploughmen and blacksmiths took up mallets, hatchets, and knives, and went into the heaps barefoot or near it, light and sure-footed where the knights were planted like posts, and killed the greatest names in France on the ground with tools. If the ranked world had an exact moment of ending, it was this one: a shepherd's boy standing over a duke, a hammer against 60 pounds of masterwork plate, and the hammer winning. Then came the part the victory speeches leave out. And this story will not. In early afternoon, with the field won, but thousands of French prisoners standing in the English rear, and a French third line still massed and unbroken ahead, and a raiding force striking the English baggage behind, Henry believed, or feared, that he was about to be attacked from both sides, while his prisoners, many still in their armour, stood among his exhausted men outnumbering their guards. He ordered the prisoners killed. His knights refused, some from honour, some from ransom money walking away, and the king assigned 200 archers to do it. And it was done, at close quarters, until the threat evaporated and the order was stopped. Contemporary writers, including French ones, largely declined to condemn him, reading it as a brutal necessity of a desperate hour. You are free to read it however you weigh it. What it must not be is left out, because the man who gave that order is the same man who prayed all night, and the same man the next chapters will crown with glory, and a story that only shows you one of those men is selling something. By late afternoon it was finished, and the accounting broke every pattern of medieval war. The French dead ran into the thousands, and the list read like a directory of the kingdom's ruling class. 3 dukes, the Constable of France, counts by the handful, and so many heads of noble families that whole provinces went into mourning at once. English losses, by the most credible accounts, ran to a few hundred at most. Among them, the Duke of York, smothered in the press like his enemies. Henry asked the name of the castle on the skyline and attached it to the day. And then, and mark this, he forbade boasting. The victory belonged to God, he said, and he meant it as theology and as message. And the message went out across Europe at the speed of a galloping horse. The verdict of 1399 had been appealed to the highest court available, trial by battle on an impossible field, and heaven had ruled, unmistakably, for the House of Lancaster. London went out of its mind. When Henry rode in that November, the city staged the greatest pageant in its history. Giants on the bridge, choirs of children dressed as angels, wine running in the conduits, and through it all the king rode in plain dark clothes, refusing to display his dented helmet, eyes down. The conqueror, playing the pilgrim with a discipline that awed the crowds more than gold could have, take one step back from the roar and look at what had actually been won. Because the honest answer is stranger than the legend. Agincourt settled nothing on the map. France was still France. Paris was still hostile. The claim was still a claim. One thing had changed, and it outweighed provinces. Before Agincourt, the Lancastrian project was a usurper's family managing a question. After Agincourt, in the eyes of England, of Europe, and above all, of Henry himself, God had signed for the dynasty. That belief was now the load-bearing wall of the whole house, and a house that rests its weight on heaven's favour has made a terrible structural choice, because heaven's favour, unlike land or law, can be read in reverses as easily as in victories. And the day the verdict appears to flip, the house does not merely lose a battle, it loses its argument for existing. But that day was decades off, and this one belonged to the archers. 6,000 sick and starving men had walked into the largest trap in Europe and broken the army of the greatest kingdom in Christendom in 3 hours. Whatever else the House of Lancaster ever was, on the 25th of October, 1415, it was the most famous family on earth, and its king, thin, scarred, 29 years old, was about to reach for the largest prize any English king had ever touched. The crown of France itself was coming loose, and Henry V intended to catch it, and the catching would cost him everything the mud had spared. Agincourt made Henry famous. What made him dangerous was that he came back. In 1417 the king landed in Normandy again, and this time there was no glorious march and no single legendary day, because Henry had graduated past battles. What he ran for the next 3 years was a conquest, methodical, administrative, and pitiless, the least romantic and most effective campaign any English king ever fought. Town by town, siege by siege, Normandy came apart in his hands. Caen fell and was sacked. Rouen, the great capital of the duchy, was starved through a winter so terrible that the city pushed thousands of its own poor out of the gates to save food, and Henry refused to let them through his lines, and they died in the ditch between the walls and the siege works, in the cold, in full view of both sides, while the garrison held out and the king held harder. Rouen surrendered in January of 1419, whatever the pageants in London said. This is what the verdict of heaven looked like up close, and Henry never pretended otherwise. War, he said, without fire was like sausages without mustard. He was a great man. Great men of that century were not gentlemen. While he ground Normandy down, France finished destroying itself, and the finishing stroke happened on a bridge. In September 1419, the two poles of French politics met to negotiate. The Duke of Burgundy and the Dauphin, the 16-year-old heir to the Mad King. They met on the bridge at Montereau, inside a fenced enclosure, sworn safe conducts on both sides. Someone in the Dauphin's party drew, and the Duke of Burgundy went down with an axe in his skull, murdered at a peace conference in front of the prince whose men killed him. A century later, a monk showing the Duke's broken skull to a visiting king would say the sentence that every historian of this period eventually quotes, because nothing truer was ever said about it. "This," said the monk, "is the hole through which the English entered France. Through it they came. The new Duke of Burgundy, son of the murdered man, wanted revenge more than he wanted a French crown, and the government of the Mad King in Paris fell in behind him. And together they turned to Henry and offered him the impossible. In May of 1420, in the cathedral at Troyes, the deal was sealed. And stand for a moment in that cathedral, because the scene held the whole century in one frame. Charles VI of France, the poor shattered king who had once believed his body was made of glass, was led through a ceremony he could not follow to sign away his own son. The Treaty of Troyes disinherited the Dauphin, the boy of the bridge, and declared him unfit to succeed. It named Henry of England, heir of France, regent of the kingdom during Charles's remaining life, and it sealed the bargain with a wedding. 2 weeks later, Henry married the Mad King's daughter, Catherine of Valois, 19 years old, and by every account, beautiful, in a ceremony that joined the two oldest enemy crowns in Europe into one family. Be exact here, because exactness is the whole point. Henry V was never King of France. The treaty made him heir, next in line behind a living king, and the arrangement had a built-in clock. Charles VI was 51, broken and fading. Henry was 33, the most feared man in Europe. At the height of his powers, all he had to do was wait, and the waiting looked short. The House of Lancaster, which 21 years earlier had been a duchy confiscated by a stroke of a pen, now stood one heartbeat from the double monarchy of England and France, the largest prize any English dynasty had ever touched. In December of 1421, at Windsor, Catherine gave birth to a son, another Henry, and the succession to both crowns ran through a single cradle. It is difficult to find, anywhere in the history of Europe, a family positioned more perfectly than the Lancasters were at that Christmas. The clock had other plans. The Dauphin, disinherited on paper, remained alive, at large, and in arms south of the Loire. And the war went on. And in the summer of 1421, Henry went back to it. The siege that finished him was not a famous one. Meaux, a fortified town east of Paris, stubborn and well led, held him through an entire winter. 8 months of trenches and river damp and camp fever. And somewhere in those months, the great enemy of this whole campaign, the one that had gutted the army at Harfleur, finally reached the king. Dysentery, the soldier's disease, the killer of the siege lines. Indifferent to rank, Meaux fell in May. Henry was already failing. Through the summer he tried to keep working, tried to ride to a campaign, and finally had to be carried in a litter. The conqueror of Normandy moved through his conquests on other men's shoulders. At the castle of Vincennes outside Paris, in the last days of August 1422, it became clear to everyone, including him, that the clock had run out. The deathbed lasted long enough for instructions, and the instructions tell you what he saw coming. Nothing about glory. He named the men who would govern, assigned his brother Bedford to hold France, warned against ever releasing certain prisoners, insisted the war go on until the treaty was fulfilled. He asked to know how long he had, and when the doctors finally told him, he had the priests read the penitential psalms. He was dealing, at the end, with the same file his father had carried into the Jerusalem chamber, and by one account he said that if God let him grow old, he had meant to take Jerusalem itself, the family dream, reaching for the family alibi one last time. He died in the small hours of the 31st of August, 1422, 35 years old. He had reigned 9 years, and filled them with more consequence than most dynasties manage in a century. 7 weeks later, in Paris, Charles VI of France died too. 7 weeks. If the dysentery had come for Henry 1 season later, he would have been crowned King of France in the cathedral where French kings were made, and the whole shape of European history would have turned on its hinge. Instead, the herald's cry rang out over 2 kingdoms for a child who could not walk. Henry VI, by grace of God, King of England and of France, was 9 months old. His father had built an empire for him. He had not lived long enough to teach him anything at all. The new reign of England opened with the great men of the realm swearing loyalty to a baby, and no one in the room found it absurd, because the alternative to solemnity was to admit the truth, that the mightiest project in Europe now hung on the health of an infant who had not yet cut all his teeth. England had never crowned a child this young. There was no rule book, and so, in the most Lancastrian move imaginable, they wrote one. The dead king's will and the lords in Parliament hammered out a constitution for the emergency. The baby's uncle, Bedford, the ablest man of the family, would govern France. His other uncle, Gloucester, glamorous, popular, and reckless, wanted the regency of England and was pointedly refused it, fobbed off with the title of protector and a council watching his hands. Between and above them moved a third figure, their great-uncle, Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester, one of the richest men in the kingdom, a prince of the church descended from John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, the bloodline barred from the throne and compensating for it magnificently. The bishop banked the crown, loan after enormous loan. The war and the government ran on Beaufort money, and power ran along the channels the money cut. The child at the centre of the machine appears in the records, in glimpses, and the glimpses are strangely touching. At 3, he was carried, shrieking and struggling, into his first Parliament, and the Lords adjourned, gravely, because the king was not in a mood to be governed with. At 7, his schooling was handed to the Earl of Warwick, a veteran of Agincourt, with written authority to discipline the royal person, and the Earl later asked the council to formally back him up because the boy was growing and beginning to resent correction. Tutors reported a child who was quick at his books, gentle, devout beyond his years. Notice what is missing from every report. Nobody ever described him as martial. In a dynasty whose entire legitimacy had been underwritten at Shrewsbury and Agincourt, whose founding argument was the sword, the heir was turning out bookish, tender, and prayerful, and the men around him told themselves he would grow into the armour. There was time. He was a child. Meanwhile, his inheritance had to be defended before he could pronounce it. And for a while, astonishingly, it was. Bedford in France proved himself very nearly his brother's equal, holding the alliance with Burgundy together with patience and a marriage. And in 1424, at Verneuil, he met the Dauphin's field army head-on and destroyed it in a battle men called a Second Agincourt, bloodier for the French than the first. The double monarchy was not a fantasy in these years. North of the Loire, it functioned. Taxes were collected in the infant's name. Courts sat. Coins were struck, showing the arms of England and France quartered together. The project only needed 2 things to survive: time and no surprise. The surprise arrived in 1429, and it was 17 years old and claimed that saints spoke to her. And this story will meet her properly in the next chapter. What matters here is what her coming forced. The Dauphin, written off as the disinherited prince of a broken cause, was suddenly anointed King of France at Rheims, in the Cathedral of Clovis, with the holy oil of French kingship, and the entire legal architecture of Troyes began to crack, because France now had a consecrated king of its own blood. And against that, the English held a treaty, and a boy. The council in London understood the argument instantly and answered it the only way available. The boy would have to be crowned, visibly, doubly. Now, So began the strangest royal tour of the Middle Ages. In November 1429, not quite 8 years old, Henry VI was crowned King of England at Westminster, small enough that observers worried the crown would hurt his neck, solemn enough that they remarked on it. A child looking, one account says, sadly and wisely on the crowd. Then they took him to France, an armed procession through a war. And in December 1431, 10 years old, he was crowned King of France in Paris, not at Rheims, where French kings were made, because Rheims was in enemy hands. Paris had to do, and Paris made its feelings known in 100 quiet ways. The ceremony was run by an English cardinal in the English style, which offended the French clergy whose cathedral it was. The banquet was, by the unanimous testimony of Parisian sources, a badly cooked embarrassment. The food, one chronicler noted with civic contempt, apparently prepared days in advance. The crowds came, watched, took the free wine, and did not warm. A boy king from across the sea, crowned by foreigners in a hungry, occupied, half-empty city that had been the capital of his French grandfather, the son of the mad glass king's daughter, wearing the crown his father had died, reaching for, in a cathedral full of people, silently waiting for him to leave. He is the only monarch in all of history ever crowned king of both England and France. And the fact is exactly as hollow as it is impressive. On parchment, no ruler in Europe stood taller than this 10-year-old. Off parchment, his southern kingdom was rallying to an anointed rival. His Burgundian alliance was quietly rotting. His money was Beaufort loans, and his own gentle nature was pointing away from everything the double crown required. The men around him had built the grandest legal structure in Christendom and set a child inside it. And the child was the single point of failure. And the child was kind and pious and slow to anger. And none of those were the load the structure was designed to bear. France, meanwhile, had stopped waiting for treaties to decide its fate. Something had shifted in the deep water of that kingdom, something the English commanders could feel before they could name it, and it had begun, of all places, in a farm village on the edge of Lorraine, in the prayers of a peasant girl who had never learned to read. The double monarchy was about to meet the one force its lawyers had never planned for. In the spring of 1429, the English war effort in France ran into something it had no category for, and the something was a teenager from a village called Domremy. Joan of Arc was about 17, a farmer's daughter who could not read or write, and she had talked her way from a frontier garrison to the Dauphin's court at Chinon on the strength of one claim, repeated with a certainty that unsettled everyone who questioned her. The saints spoke to her, she said, and the saints had a message. God had not abandoned the Dauphin. France was to be saved, and she was to save it. And the first step was Orleans. Orleans was the hinge of the war. The city sat on the Loire, the river line dividing English France from the Dauphin's France, and the English had been strangling it with siege works for half a year. If Orleans fell, the road south lay open, and most professional soldiers on both sides assumed it would fall. The Dauphin's councillors examined the girl. The churchmen questioned her for weeks, and in the end, and the fact that they did this tells you how desperate the cause had become, they gave her armour, a banner, and a place with the relief army. She rode into Orleans at the end of April 1429. 9 days later, the siege was broken. The English forts stormed one after another. The girl herself, wounded by an arrow, above the breast and back at the fighting before the day ended. 9 days. Then the Loire campaign. English garrisons peeled off the river in weeks. And then, in June, at Patay, the thing that was not supposed to be possible, a French army caught the English field force in open country before its archers could plant their stakes, and the cavalry went through them, and the longbow line that had held at Agincourt was ridden down and annihilated. The English lost more men in an afternoon at Patay than in the 3 hours of Agincourt. And something more valuable than men, they lost the spell, because that is what this was about, and both sides knew it, which is why this chapter belongs in a story about the House of Lancaster. Remember what Agincourt had been converted into. Not a victory, a verdict. Heaven had ruled for Lancaster, and that verdict was the load-bearing wall of the whole double monarchy. Now came a peasant girl in white armour, announcing the appeal and winning it, publicly, miraculously, at Orleans and on the Loire. And every victory she touched was an argument aimed at the exact foundation of English France. If God had signed for Lancaster in 1415, who was signing for this girl in 1429? She never fought the English so much as she prosecuted them, and the proof of how well the prosecution landed is what she did next. She took the Dauphin, the disinherited prince of the bridge at Montereau, through hostile country to Reims, the coronation city of France, where the holy oil was kept. The oil, legend said, had been brought from heaven itself, and, in July 1429, the man the Treaty of Troyes had erased was anointed and crowned Charles VII, King of France, with the girl standing beside the altar, holding her banner. Parchment against chrism. The English held a treaty, signed by a madman. France now held a king made by God in the right cathedral with the right oil. And in the 15th century, that was not symbolism. That was the law behind the law. The English response confirmed how precisely the blow had struck. When Burgundian troops captured Joan outside Compiègne in 1430, the English bought her for a king's ransom. And what they staged at Rouen was not a criminal trial, but a theological counterattack. She was tried by a church court, packed and paid for the purpose, not for treason or war, but for heresy, for claiming that her voices came from God. It had to be heresy. If her voices were from God, then England's verdict was overturned, and the whole Lancastrian claim in France was a defiance of heaven. The court laboured for months to make her condemn herself, and the transcripts survive, and they are astonishing. An illiterate teenager parrying doctors of theology day after day, asked whether she knew she was in God's grace. A question designed as a perfect trap. Since yes was presumption and no was confession, she answered, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there." The learned men moved on. In the end, they burned her anyway, in the market square at Rouen, on the 30th of May, 1431. At about 19 years old, an English soldier, the story goes, handed her a cross of 2 sticks. The executioner testified he feared damnation for what he had done. And stand back and look at what the English had just told Europe. Because everyone saw it, the regime whose entire argument was God's favour had needed to burn a teenage girl to keep the argument alive. The bonfire was a confession. 25 years later, a French court would formally annul the verdict. And centuries on, the church her judges claimed to serve would make her a saint. What she started did not burn. The tide she turned kept coming. Slow, tidal, remorseless. And now the structure of English, France began to lose its walls one by one. In 1435, the diplomats gathered at Arras for a great peace congress. And there the alliance that made everything possible ended. Burgundy, whose murdered duke had been the hole through which the English entered France, made peace with the man in whose presence his father had been murdered. Charles VII performed the apologies, paid the prices, and the new Duke of Burgundy, revenge, finally cooling after 16 years, changed sides. 1 week before the treaty was sealed, in Rouen, the Duke of Bedford died, worn out at 46, the ablest man the House of Lancaster ever produced. Spared by days from watching his life's work sign itself away, the double monarchy lost its architect and its ally in the same 7 days. The next spring, Paris itself opened its gates to the soldiers of Charles VII, and the capital, where a 10-year-old had been crowned King of France, went back to being simply French. 5 years after the ceremony, here is the ledger of the decade, and it should be read the way the council in London read it, with a cold feeling climbing the spine. Orleans, lost. The field army, broken at Patay, the rival, anointed at Rheims with the true oil. The girl, burned, and the burning already curdling into her legend. Burgundy, gone. Bedford, dead. Paris, gone. The project was not yet destroyed. Normandy and Gascony still held. Garrisons still flew the quartered arms. But the project was now a body, losing blood, with no way to make more. Because the one transfusion that could have saved it was the thing the House of Lancaster could no longer produce. A king, a warrior king, an Agincourt king, a king who could ride to Rouen and make the verdict of heaven look current. What the house had instead was growing up quietly in England, kneeling at his prayers, wincing at bloodshed, planning colleges. France was waking up, and the man whose whole inheritance depended on keeping it asleep was the gentlest human being of his dynasty ever produced. The war his grandfather started and his father escalated was about to land, in its entirety, on precisely the wrong Lancaster, the one who would have made a wonderful monk. Strip away everything you think you know about failed kings, because Henry VI fails in a way that has no villain in it, and that is what makes him unbearable. Watch him first. Grown now, riding through London in the 1440s, he dresses, courtiers complain, like a farmer or a townsman, a long dark gown, round-toed shoes, nothing in fashion. Beneath the royal robes on state days, he wears a rough hair shirt against his skin. He blushes and turns his face away. The reports say, at the sight of too much bare flesh at a court entertainment, confronted, riding into the city one day, with a piece of a traitor's quartered body displayed over the gate, the customary furniture of a medieval capital, he ordered it taken down, saying he would not have any Christian man so cruelly handled on his account. He pardoned, constantly, chronically, men his judges had condemned, men who had rebelled against him personally, where his grandfather had starved a king and his father had ordered prisoners killed in a battle's crisis. This, Henry could not bear to watch the machinery of death that every medieval government ran as routine. Set him in almost any other seat. A bishop's, a scholar's, a country lord's, and the sources describing him would read as a portrait of a genuinely holy man. The problem, and the tragedy, has no other ingredient, is the seat he was actually in. His one great passion shows you the king he might have been in a kinder century. In the 1440s, still in his early 20s, Henry founded 2 colleges, planned in loving detail, endowed with conquered priory as revenues, their statutes annotated in his own concerns. Eton, beneath the walls of Windsor, a school where 70 poor boys would be educated free, and King's College at Cambridge, where Eton scholars would go on. And for kings, he commissioned a chapel on a scale that made no sense, a private royal church with the dimensions of a cathedral, fan-vaulted stone unrolling overhead like the inside of a shell, a building so beautiful that 5 centuries later it is still the postcard of English learning. Americans who have never heard this king's name know his buildings. Eton educated 20 British prime ministers. King's College Chapel is the image on the Christmas broadcasts. The most catastrophic reign in English history, left behind, as its most permanent monuments, 2 schools. Sit with that. It is the whole man in one sentence. A king who could build for eternity and could not govern a Tuesday. Because here is what the same man looked like from inside the government. And the honest portrait requires both halves. Kingship in the 14th and 15th centuries was not ceremonial. The king was the operating system, the judge of last resort, the distributor of every office and favour, the one will that kept a court of armed, ambitious magnates from settling their quarrels privately. That structure has a single hard requirement, the ability to say no. Henry could not say it. Petitioners discovered that the king granted what was put in front of him, and so they put everything in front of him, and he granted the same office twice to 2 different men, gave away crown lands and revenues in a torrent, forgave debts the treasury was counting on, the royal finances, already strained by the war, slid toward a bankruptcy no medieval king had ever quite achieved, while, around the open-handed king, a circle of insiders formed, as it always forms, men who controlled what reached the royal ear and grew rich on the traffic. The court became a machine for converting the king's gentleness into their fortune, and the kingdom watched it happen, and noticed the shape of the trap closing around this family for the 3rd time in 3 generations. Because it is the same trap with a new door. The grandfather seized a crown, arguing that a king who governed badly could be removed. The father answered the doubt with victory. The son could neither govern nor fight. And so, the question of 1399, twice buried, twice risen, began to circle again, patiently, and this time it circled a man who would not even defend himself. Ask the fair question, the one his defenders and his accusers both have to answer. Was Henry VI actually simple, actually incapable, or a decent intelligence crushed by an impossible job? The sources genuinely divide. His enemies, and later the Yorkist regime that replaced him, spread the picture of a natural fool, and propaganda is not evidence. His admirers, and the memoir of his own chaplain glows with love, describe wisdom, learning, prophetic insight, the sober middle, which is where the best modern historians land. describes a man of real piety and real intermittent engagement, capable of pursuing what he cared about. His colleges, peace with France, mercy, and passive nearly everywhere else. A king who reigned sincerely and ruled barely at all. What no one describes, anywhere, in 30 years of records before his collapse, is a king anyone feared. And this system ran on fear, the way a body runs on blood. The men around him understood all of it. And by the early 1440s, the government of England faced a problem it could discuss only in whispers. The war in France was being lost by increments. The treasury was empty. The magnates were arming their retinues and eyeing each other. And the operating system at the center of everything was a man in a hair shirt designing chapels. Something had to supply the will the king did not have. The council's answer, the traditional answer, the answer that had worked for 1,000 years of dynasties, was a marriage. Find the king a queen. A queen would mean heirs, and heirs would mean stability, and perhaps a strong consort would put a spine into the soft center of the regime. The search turned, as English royal searches always turned, to France, where a peace party at both courts was groping toward a settlement, and the candidate the diplomats produced was a 15-year-old girl from the house of Anjou, a duke's daughter with no dowry to speak of, a formidable mother, and a will, as England would learn over the next 30 years, of tempered steel. Her name was Margaret, and the marriage that was supposed to save the House of Lancaster was about to hand its enemies every weapon they would ever need. The wedding of Henry VI was a masterpiece of things going wrong quietly. The bride was Margaret of Anjou, 15 years old, niece of the Queen of France by marriage, daughter of a duke, famous across Europe for holding grand titles, King of Naples, King of Jerusalem, and controlling almost none of the territory attached to them. She arrived in England in the spring of 1445, so short of funds that arrangements around her wardrobe and expenses had to be patched together. A Queen of England beginning her reign. In effect, on credit, the couple married in April at Titchfield Abbey, quietly, and the girl was crowned in Westminster weeks later to genuine celebration, because England wanted to love her. She was young, spirited, reportedly good-looking, and she represented the thing the exhausted kingdom wanted most: peace with France. What England did not know was what the peace had cost, because the bill had a secret clause. The marriage negotiations, run by the king's favourite, the Earl of Suffolk, had produced no dowry worth the name. And worse, within months, under French pressure and with the king's devout approval, England agreed to surrender the county of Maine, a strategic buffer province south of Normandy, as the price of extending the truce. The surrender was so explosive that it was kept from the political nation, negotiated in private assurances. The king's own letter, promising it away. Secrets like that do not keep. When Maine was finally handed over in 1448, after years of stalling that enraged the French and humiliated the English garrisons, ordered to walk away from their own land, the story was fully out, and the country drew the conclusion. Countries always draw. The marriage had been a swindle. The favourite had sold English blood-soaked ground for a penniless bride, and the young queen, guiltless of the negotiation she had been the token in, was now attached in the public mind to the surrender. She was 18, foreign, French, and blamed. Nothing that happened in the next 30 years ever fully washed that first stain out. And fairness requires saying at the start what the propaganda never said. Margaret of Anjou did not lose France, did not empty the treasury, and did not invent the feuds that were about to tear England open. She walked, at 15, into a court already rotting, and learned its politics faster than the men running it. And her real offence, the one underneath all the others, was that she turned out to be better at the game than the people who assumed she was a pawn. The truce her marriage bought did not even hold. In 1449, an English force, in one of the stupidest acts of the entire war, sacked a Breton border town in peacetime, handing Charles VII the pretext he had spent years preparing for. The French king declared the truce void and invaded Normandy. And what followed shocked even pessimists. The duchy that Henry V had spent 5 years grinding into English hands collapsed in about one. The French army had been rebuilt, professionalized, and above all, re-gunned. Its new artillery train, cracking English, held walls in days that had once withstood months. And the underpaid, undermanned garrisons fell like a row of doors kicked in. Rouen, the capital, where Joan had burned, opened its gates. In April 1450, at Formigny, the last English field army in Normandy was destroyed, and by summer the duchy was gone. Entire 3 decades of conquest, the whole material legacy of Agincourt's king, erased between one harvest and the next. England received the news the way a body receives poison. The soldiers came home first. Thousands of them, veterans and garrison families, dumped on the Kent coast with nothing, begging along the roads where victory parades had passed a generation earlier, living proof of the government's shame straggling toward London. The capital wanted names, and the first name was Suffolk. The favourite was impeached in Parliament, with the country baying for him, and the king doing the merciful thing at the most disastrous possible moment, shielded him from trial and commuted everything to 5 years of exile. The ship carrying Suffolk out of England was intercepted in the Channel by another vessel whose crew had their own verdict in mind. They held a mock trial on deck, found him guilty in the name of the community of the realm, and beheaded him over the ship's side with a rusty sword. By the account that reached shore, 6 strokes to finish it. His body was dumped on the sands of Dover. The message was addressed to the entire governing class. If the king's justice would not function, England was beginning to improvise its own. Kent rose next. That summer of 1450, and the rising deserves a clear look because of what it was not. Jack Cade's rebellion was not a peasant mob and not an attempt to unthrone the king. Its ranks were full of respectable men, small landholders, craftsmen, village constable, and its manifesto read like an audit: the king's revenues wasted, justice sold, the ring of favourites strangling the royal ear, the losses in France, and a demand that the king call to his council the true lords of the blood, naming above all the Duke of York. Tens of thousands camped on Blackheath, defeated a royal detachment sent against them, and entered London itself, where Cade struck the London stone with his sword like a man taking possession. For a few days the rebels ran tribunals, and the king's most hated treasurer was dragged out and beheaded in Cheapside. Then the occupation curdled into looting. London's own citizens rose against their guests. A night battle was fought on London Bridge, and the rising broke apart on the pardons the government scattered, with Cade himself hunted down and dying of his wounds in a cart. The rebellion failed, and its meaning stood. The Commons of England had marched an army into the capital to demand, in effect, competent government, and the king had answered by leaving town for the Midlands. Everyone had now seen the centre, and the centre was soft, and the audit had named a name, and the name would not go away. Richard, Duke of York, was the wealthiest magnate in England and the most dangerous man in this story, who was not yet doing anything dangerous, great-grandson of Edward III, down two separate lines. One of them, through the Mortimers, arguably senior to the entire Lancastrian claim. He was the man the whispered arithmetic of 1399 had always pointed toward, and everyone knew it. And for years he had served loyally anyway, governing in France, absorbing enormous unpaid crown debts. What radicalized him was not blood. It was watching the men who had lost Normandy stay in power. The court's new strongman, the Duke of Somerset, was a Beaufort, a grandson of John of Gaunt's legitimized bastard line, and Somerset had personally presided over the Norman collapse, and had been rewarded with control of the king. For York it was a double insult, national and personal, and in 1452 he finally marched on London with an armed force to demand Somerset's removal, and found the gates shut, and was outmanoeuvred, forced to swear submission in St. Paul's, while Somerset stood by untouched. The lesson York took away was the lesson everything in this reign taught. Petitioning did not work. Parliament did not work. The King's grace did not work, because the King's grace was a mirror reflecting whoever stood closest. By the summer of 1453, the kingdom was a floor of spilled gunpowder waiting for its spark. And then, from the one remaining corner of English France, came the last flash of the old fire. Gascony, English for 300 years, had fallen to Charles VII, then risen for England again, and a final army under the ancient war hero Talbot had sailed to hold it. In July, at Castillon, Talbot charged an entrenched French artillery park head-on, and the guns shredded the last army of the 100 Years' War, and Talbot died in the wreck of it. Bordeaux fell for good in the autumn. After 3 centuries of the whole French inheritance of the English crown, of the double monarchy, a baby had been crowned to rule. There remained exactly one town, Calais, and nothing else. The news from Gascony reached the king at a hunting lodge in Wiltshire that August, and Henry VI, 31 years old, who had inherited 2 kingdoms and now watched the second one finish dying, stopped speaking. It happened at Clarendon, the royal hunting lodge near Salisbury, in the first days of August 1453, and the men who were there could only describe it from the outside, which is all history has ever had. The king suffered, the report said, a sudden and frightening sickness, and when the sickness passed, Henry remained. He sat where he was placed. He did not speak, did not respond to speech, did not react to faces, gave no sign of knowing where or who he was. He could be moved, fed, dressed, led from room to room like a sleepwalker, and nothing came back out. The man was present. The king had vanished. Be careful here, as the men of that time could not be. No one can diagnose a patient across 5.5 centuries, and this story will not pretend to. What the records support is plain enough. A total collapse, mental and physical, lasting about a year and a half. Arriving within days of the news of Castillon, the final annihilation of his father's French empire, the court physicians tried the pharmacy of the age: potion, bleedings, purges, and reached nothing, and every mind in England ran the same private calculation within a week, because everyone knew the family history. Henry's grandfather, through his mother, Catherine, was Charles VI of France, the king who had believed his body was made of glass, who had gone mad for 2 decades in episodes that crippled a kingdom. The blood of Valois had carried something down into the blood of Lancaster, or so the whole political nation silently concluded, and whether the conclusion was medicine or superstition, it did the same work. The house whose claim rested on God's favour now had, at its centre, what the age could only read as God's affliction. The government kept it secret, which tells you they understood the stakes instantly, for weeks, then months. The collapse of the King of England was managed like contraband, council business smoothed over, access controlled, while behind the screen the men of the court waited for a recovery that did not come. And, in the middle of the concealment, in October, the dynasty received the miracle it had prayed 30 years for, timed by fate with perfect cruelty. At Westminster, Queen Margaret gave birth to a son. After 8 years of childless marriage, an heir, a Prince of Wales, the future of the House of Lancaster, born healthy and named Edward, and his father could not be made to see him. They brought the baby to the king. Nothing. And in January, when the formal presentation could be delayed no longer, the Duke of Buckingham carried the infant prince to Windsor and placed him before the king, and begged him to bless his son. And the Queen came in and pleaded in her turn. And the record of what followed is 1 sentence long and among the coldest sentences in English history. The king looked on the child once and cast his eyes down again, and that was all. Now the machine of the realm faced the question it was built never to face. The operating system was down. The heir was an infant, and the 2 obvious regents were the 2 people the kingdom trusted least together. Margaret moved first, and understand her position before the caricature gets to her. She was 23, foreign, already blamed for a surrendered province, holding a newborn whose entire future depended on the crown staying exactly where it was. And she watched the lords circling her husband's silence and drew the obvious conclusion that a regency would become a custody, and a custody of the king could become, by one short step, a custody of the succession. In the new year, she presented the council with a bill of articles claiming, in effect, the full regency for herself, the whole rule of the realm. The lords of England looked at a French queen demanding sovereign power, and did what 15th century lords were always going to do. In March 1454, they chose the alternative, and the alternative was the one man Margaret was most certain wanted her son's inheritance. Richard of York was named protector and defender of the realm. Here is the surprise. The propaganda of both sides, later buried. York's protectorate was good government. He behaved, by nearly every sober account, with restraint and competence, took the office by council appointment and not by force, restored a measure of order, and aimed his power at exactly one man, his enemy Somerset, the architect of the French collapse, who went to the Tower to await trial. The realm, for about a year, was governed, and the entire arrangement rested on a single assumption, so obvious no one wrote it down. The king would not wake up around Christmas 1454. The king woke up. The recovery was as sudden and total as the collapse. Henry surfaced from the fog with no memory of the missing 18 months. And when they brought his son to him, a boy now more than a year old, the king was astonished and asked, by the chaplain's account, who the child's godfathers were, and said he must have been begotten by the Holy Ghost, a sentence his enemies would sharpen and reuse for 20 years in exactly the way you would expect. He was gentle, grateful, devout, entirely himself, and his return, which the court celebrated as a resurrection, was in fact the detonation, because everything the Protectorate had built ran on the king's absence, and the king's presence handed it all back to the old machine. York's commission ended. Somerset walked out of the Tower, uncharged, untried, restored within weeks to the king's right hand. Every reform stopped. The court party regathered around the awakened king like iron filings around a magnet, and York and his allies, the great northern house of Neville chief among them, found themselves not merely out of power but marked, summoned to councils they suspected were traps, watching Somerset rebuild the apparatus that had already ruined them once. Stand at the beginning of 1455 and look at what the sleep and the waking had done, because the damage was structural now. Past personalities, past mending. Every player had learned a lesson, and the lessons could not coexist. Margaret had learned that the Lords would hand her husband's power, and with it her son's future, to the one man whose bloodline made him a rival, and that only her own network, her own men, her own hardness stood between the cradle and the ambitions of others. York had learned that law, service, and patience bought him a year of office and then nothing, that Somerset was untouchable while the king breathed and smiled, and that the king's grace was a door that opened only for his enemies. And England had learned the deepest lesson of all, the one no one could unlearn. The realm had run for a year and a half without its king, had in fact run rather better without him, and the sky had not fallen. The mystery of monarchy, the thing that made an anointed king different in kind from other men, had been quietly disproved by 18 months of managed silence. His grandfather had seized the crown with an army. His father had sanctified it with a miracle in the mud. It would take one more ingredient, and the ingredient was on its way, because in May of 1455, York and the Nevilles stopped petitioning and armed their retainers, and rode south to intercept the king and his court on the road, at a market town called St. Albans, and this time nobody was carrying documents. The first battle of England's civil war lasted about half an hour and was fought in a shopping street. On the 22nd of May, 1455, the royal party, moving north with the king and perhaps 2,000 men, stopped inside the little market town of St. Albans and barricaded the lanes. York and his Neville allies, the Earl of Salisbury and Salisbury's son, the Earl of Warwick, arrived with maybe 3,000 and camped in the fields beyond the ditch. What followed first was hours of the old ritual. Heralds walking back and forth, York's petitions protesting perfect loyalty to the king and demanding only the surrender of Somerset. The king's answers, drafted by the men around him, refusing. By mid-morning the ritual was exhausted. It had been exhausted. In truth, for 5 years, the assault on the barricades jammed. Then Warwick, 26 years old and about to become the most famous soldier in England, took his men through the unguarded middle of the town, through back lanes, and, by the accounts, straight through private houses, smashing through garden walls, and came out in the market square in the centre of the royal position. Trumpets going, his war cry in the streets, the royal line collapsed into a running fight among the shop fronts, and the archery that opened it wounded men standing at the very centre of the kingdom. The king himself, standing under his banner in the square, was struck in the neck by an arrow, a graze, but a bleeding one, and led into a tanner's cottage, an anointed monarch, sitting wounded among the hides, while his court was cut apart within earshot. His banner, one account says with a shudder, was found leaning against a house wall, abandoned by its bearer. The killing, when you tally it, was tiny. Well under 200 dead. Read the names instead of the numbers, because the names are the war, Somerset, the Queen's pillar, the target of the whole enterprise, was cornered in the doorway of an inn called the Castle and cut down fighting, and men remembered afterward that a fortune-teller had once warned him to beware castles. The Earl of Northumberland, head of the mighty Percy family, killed Lord Clifford, a great northern baron, killed. The battle had lasted minutes, and in those minutes the leadership of the court party had been, there is no softer, honest word, assassinated in the street, and each of those dead lords had a son, and each son was of an age to remember, and the new Lord Clifford and the new Percy heirs would spend the rest of their short lives collecting the debt. England had just discovered the terrible efficiency of political murder under the flag of battle, and the discovery could not be taken back. What did York do with his victory? He knelt. He and the Nevilles found the bleeding king in the tanner's cottage, dropped to their knees, and swore they had never meant harm to his person, only to the traitors around him, and they escorted Henry back to London with royal honours, and a parliament duly blamed the dead Somerset for everything, and York was soon protector again, briefly, until the king's party regathered and eased him out once more. On the surface, the Constitution had hiccuped and recovered. Underneath, everyone understood what St. Albans had actually established. Grievances could be settled by killing the other side's leaders in the king's presence, and the king would then pardon the killers, because the king pardoned everyone. The Crown, the one institution whose whole purpose was to make private war unnecessary, had become a trophy that legitimized whichever faction physically held it. That is the true beginning of the Wars of the Roses. And note in passing what the name itself is. A beautiful label pasted on much later. From the badges, the two sides sometimes wore, by writers who wanted the chaos to look like heraldry. The men inside it called it nothing so pretty. They called it the world turned upside down. For 4 years the war did not so much rage as smoulder, because nobody wanted it. And this is worth saying against every dramatization ever filmed. These were not two armies encamped for a generation. They were one governing class, intermarried, sharing pews and hunting parties, sliding by inches into a feud none of them could stop, while the Queen and York built rival machines around a king who belonged to whoever reached him first. Margaret, who never forgave St. Albans and never trusted York's kneeling, moved the court out of hostile London to the Midlands, her son's own country, and set about raising men. And the little Prince of Wales became the emblem of her cause. The livery of the swan, going out to retainers, sworn not so much to Henry as to the succession itself, and in 1458 the king, the one person in England who genuinely wanted peace, staged the most heartbreaking ceremony of the century to get it, the Love Day. He called it a formal public reconciliation. And on a March morning, the deadliest enemies in the kingdom walked in procession, hand in hand, to St. Paul's Cathedral, Salisbury, with Somerset's vengeful young son, Warwick, with the new Lord Clifford whose father Warwick's men had killed, and behind them, hand in hand, Richard of York and Queen Margaret herself, walking like dance partners while the king beamed. Every man and woman in that procession had already priced the ceremony at its true value. They held hands in the morning and counted retainers in the afternoon. Within a year, someone tallied. The same lords walking to church together had armed followings in the tens of thousands. And the Love Day survives in history as the exact measurement of how far a good man's goodness reaches in politics. Which is to say, one morning, when it finally broke open again, in 1459, it broke badly for York. At Ludford Bridge that autumn the Yorkist lords, facing a royal army that had the king visibly present in it, watched a key contingent of their best professional soldiers refuse to fight against the king's own banner and defect in the night, and the Yorkist leadership simply scattered before dawn. York to Ireland, Warwick and Salisbury and York's eldest son Edward to Calais, leaving York's wife and youngest children standing in the town to be captured, and the Queen's Parliament attainted them all, root and branch, their lands forfeit, their heirs disinherited, the full legal annihilation of the House of York. Attainder was the nuclear weapon of 15th century politics, and Margaret, protecting her son's inheritance by destroying theirs, had just taught the Yorkists that this war no longer had a negotiated exit. A man attainted has nothing left to lose, which makes him the most dangerous kind of man there is. They came back in 1460, Warwick and young Edward, landing in Kent, welcomed into London, and at Northampton in July, in a rainstorm. Treachery inside, the royal lines opened the barricades, and the king was taken again, standing bewildered in his tent while men died around it. Captured property once more. And then, that autumn, Richard of York returned from Ireland and finally said the thing out loud. He marched to Westminster, walked into the Parliament chamber under a sword carried upright before him, strode to the empty throne, and put his hand on it, and turned to the Lords, expecting the acclamation, and was met with a silence you can still hear in the sources. Even his own allies had never agreed to this. The Archbishop of Canterbury asked whether he wished to see the king. York's answer rang with 60 years of the family arithmetic. "I know of no person in this realm," he said, "whom it does not behoove to come to me, rather than I to him." But the silence held, and, out of the impasse, the lawyers built the Act of Accord, the strangest constitutional document of the age. Henry VI would remain king for life, and at his death the crown would pass, over the head of his living son, to York and York's heirs. They brought it to the gentle king, who was assured his own reign was safe, and he agreed to it, and, with his agreement, signed away his 7-year-old child. They had disinherited the boy, They appear to have believed, because Henry was mild, and Henry consented, that the matter was thereby settled. It is the last innocent mistake anyone in this story makes, because the boy had a mother, and the mother was in the north, raising an army. And when the news of the act reached Margaret of Anjou, the war stopped being about who advised the king. From that day, it was about killing, hers or theirs, and everyone had just run out of documents. The bill for the Act of Accord arrived within weeks, and it arrived first for York himself. He marched north in December 1460 to deal with the Queen's gathering army, kept a wary Christmas at his castle of Sandal near Wakefield, and then, on the 30th of December, for reasons argued about ever since, a foraging party, a trick, a rush of blood, came down from the safety of his walls with a fraction of his force and was swallowed. The Lancastrian army closed around him in the open fields, and Richard of York, the man who had touched the throne 10 weeks earlier, died fighting in the snow mud of Wakefield. His second son, 17-year-old Edmund, was caught fleeing across Wakefield Bridge, and young Lord Clifford, whose father had died in the doorway at St. Albans, killed the boy where he stood, by the account tradition preserved, saying, "Thy father slew mine, and so will I do thee, and all thy kin." Salisbury was taken and beheaded the next day, and then the Queen's side did the thing that turned feud into holy war. They cut the heads from the corpses, spiked them on the gates of the city of York, and on the brow of the Duke, who would be king, they nailed a crown made of paper. The paper crown was meant as the last word of a settled argument. It functioned instead as a starting gun, because York's eldest son was alive, and he was 18, and he was nothing like his careful, grievance, nursing father. Edward, Earl of March, stood 6 feet 4 inches, the tallest king in all of English history, beautiful, affable, and, as the next decade would prove, one of the most naturally gifted battlefield commanders the island ever produced. In February he destroyed a Lancastrian force at Mortimer's Cross in Wales, under a dawn sky in which, by several accounts, atmospheric ice made 3 suns appear to rise together, a par helion, which the boy read aloud to his frightened army as the Holy Trinity shining for their cause. An 18-year-old converting a weather event into a mandate from heaven in real time. Weeks later, Warwick lost the king himself, defeated at the Second Battle of St. Albans. Henry recovered by the Queen's army, found, by the famous report, sitting under a tree, and the road to London lay open before Margaret. And here the war turned on something stranger than a battle. Her northern army's reputation for plunder had run ahead of it. Terror organized the capital against her. London's gates stayed shut. And the Queen, unpaid army eating itself, turned back north. Edward rode into the city she had declined to force, and London, which always knew a winner, roared for him, and in early March 1461 he was proclaimed King Edward IV at Westminster. England now had 2 crowned arguments walking around alive, and everyone understood there was only one court left that could rule on the case. Both sides marched north for the largest battle ever fought on English soil. They met on Palm Sunday, the 29th of March, 1461, on a high open plateau in Yorkshire between the villages of Towton and Saxton, in a snowstorm. And now, if this story has done its work, you should feel a cold prickle of recognition, because you have seen this exact recipe before. Look at the list from that night before Agincourt, 46 years earlier, and check the items off. A freakish weather event, a constricted killing ground, massed longbows deciding everything before the hand fighting starts, exhausted men in the mud, and the mud choosing who lives. Every ingredient is here, on this Yorkshire plateau, and every single one has been turned around and pointed at the House of Lancaster. Because at Agincourt the weather and the bows and the mud belong to England against France. And at Towton, England is both armies. The miracle of 1415 is about to be run in a mirror, and the family that owned the original is standing on the wrong side of the glass. The numbers alone put this day in its own category. The chroniclers claimed the two armies together approached or passed 100,000 men. And even the sober modern estimates, running 50 to 65,000 combined, mean that something close to 1 in every 100 living English people stood on that field. The greatest single gathering of Englishmen for the purpose of killing Englishmen in the island's history. The Lancastrians, likely somewhat larger, held the ridge line with their backs toward the little River Cock. The wind, when the snow thickened toward mid-morning, blew from the south into Lancastrian faces, and the whole battle turned first on that one meteorological fact, because Edward's veteran archery commander saw it instantly. The Yorkist bowmen loosed, the wind carrying their arrows deep and hard and blinding snow hiding their true position, and the Lancastrian archers, shooting into the gale with snow in their eyes, watched their own volleys fall 40 yards short, spent into empty ground. Then the Yorkist archers walked forward, and, in the detail, every account preserves, because it is almost too neat, pulled the wasted Lancastrian arrows out of the snow and shot them back at the men who had bought them. At Agincourt, the longbow had been the fist of the English miracle. At Towton, the longbow was simply English, on both sides, and the wind decided whose weapon it would be, and heaven's verdict. That old, load-bearing wall of the Lancastrian house was being delivered by weather to the other team. The arrow storm did what arrow storms do. It made standing still unbearable, and so the Lancastrian mass came down off its ridge to close, surrendering the high ground to escape the sky. And the two largest armies England ever raised met hand to hand in a blizzard and stayed locked together for hours. Not the trim half hour of St. Albans. Hours, most of the daylight of that Palm Sunday. Lines grinding. Men rotated forward over the dead. The fighting pausing. Witnesses said, only long enough to drag the corpses into heaps, so there was footing to continue, and no quarter asked or offered, because both kings, this is recorded of the day, had ordered that no prisoners be taken. Somewhere in mid-afternoon, the Duke of Norfolk's delayed Yorkist division came up the road out of the snow and folded into the Lancastrian left, and the balance, hour by hour, tipped, and toward dusk, the Lancastrian line did what lines do at last. It came apart all at once. What followed the breaking was worse than the battle, and the land itself still testifies to it. The rout poured down the plateau's steep western slope toward the flooded little river. Armoured men wading, drowning, the bridge, by tradition, collapsing under the fugitives, until, the accounts agree, men crossed the stream on the bodies of other men, and the water ran red far downstream, and the shallow valley the fleeing thousands died in is called Bloody Meadow on maps to this day. The pursuit ran through the night and miles beyond, when the heralds and the burial parties made their counts. The figure that went to Europe in ambassadors' letters, and it staggered Europe, was 28,000 dead, and while modern historians argue it downward, the honest summary is that nobody doubts Towton killed on a scale England had never seen and would never see again on its own soil. The bloodiest day in all of English history. Bloodier for Englishmen than the first day of the Somme. 5.5 centuries later, archaeologists opening a mass grave by Towton Hall found the skeletons stacked, skulls bearing 8, 10, a dozen blade wounds, faces methodically destroyed, and one skull whose old healed cheek wound showed its owner had survived some earlier battle's arrow, had been carefully surgeoned back to life once. Like the boy prince at Shrewsbury long ago, and had come to Towton and been granted no second miracle. Henry VI was not on the field. He was at York, at his prayers. It was Palm Sunday, while the largest army ever raised in his name was annihilated in the snow 11 miles away. When the news came, the king, the queen, and the 7-year-old prince rode north in the dark for Scotland, a royal family reduced to fugitives with a border to make, and behind them Edward IV entered York and took down, from the gates, the paper-crowned head of his father and replaced it with the freshly severed heads of Lancastrians. The verdict of heaven. Read the way this whole century read battles. Could not have been plainer if it had been printed. God had spoken through the wind and the snow, and God, it appeared, had changed sides. The house that had seized a crown at Westminster proved it in the mud at Agincourt, and lost it in the person of a praying king, was now 3 exiles on a winter road, a broken army behind them, and everything ahead of them narrowing to one unbreakable woman's refusal to accept the arithmetic. England had a new king, 19 years old, 6'4", victorious, and legitimate by exactly the same title as the man his grandfather's generation had knelt to in 1401 before him. The sword. The Lancasters had written that rule themselves, 62 years earlier, in Westminster Hall, at Towton. England simply enforced it against its authors. In the summer of 1465, a dinner was interrupted at a manor house in Lancashire. The guest at the table was a tall, shabby, quiet man in his mid-40s, travelling under no name in particular, and he had been a wanderer in the northern hills for the better part of a year, moving from safe house to safe house, sheltered by families who kept the old loyalty and kept it at the risk of their necks. Someone had talked. Armed men surrounded the house, and the quiet man was taken as he tried to slip away into the woods near a river crossing. And the men who took him knew exactly what they had caught. He was Henry of Windsor, son of the victor of Agincourt, grandson of the usurper of 1399, anointed and crowned King of England and of France, and for the past year his kingdom had consisted of borrowed beds, disguised rides across moorland, and the prayers he never stopped saying. They tied his feet to the stirrups of his horse, put, by one account, a mocking straw hat on his head, and led him south to London in stages, displayed on the road like a fair exhibit. The Lord's anointed trussed like a poacher. At the Tower of London the gates closed behind him. He would be a prisoner there. this first time, for 5 years. Rewind the 4 years since Towton to see how it had come to the dinner table in Lancashire. The fugitive royal family had made Scotland, and Margaret had begun at once doing what Margaret did, which was refuse to lose. She bargained shamelessly, because the destitute cannot bargain any other way, trading the great border fortress of Berwick to the Scots for shelter and soldiers, mortgaging Calais to France for money and men. Actions her enemies called treason and her defenders called arithmetic. A queen with no country selling pieces of a claim to keep the claim alive. Through the early 1460s she threw invasion after small invasion at the Northumbrian coast, and the great border castles changed hands like cards, and twice the cause caught real fire, and twice it was stamped out, until, in the spring of 1464, the last Lancastrian field force in England was brought to battle at Hexham and broken for good, and the leaders who had carried the war since Towton went to the block in batches. The Duke of Somerset, son of the man killed in the inn doorway at St. Albans, was beheaded the evening of the battle. After Hexham there was no Lancastrian army, no Lancastrian treasury, and no Lancastrian court, only a king hiding in the hills, and a queen who had already taken her son across the sea. Margaret's exile court gathered in her father's county of Bar, in eastern France, at a castle called Cur, and the reports that survive from it are a study in stubbornness. Perhaps 200 souls, the hard remnant, living, one of them wrote home, on her father's charity, and not much of it, great lords of England patching their clothes. The Queen herself, described by a visitor as having nothing royal left but her manor, which had, if anything, hardened. In the middle of this genteel poverty grew the boy, everything now orbited, Edward of Lancaster, Prince of Wales, had been 7 when his world ended at Towton. He turned 10, 12, 14 at Cur, an heir raised entirely inside the wound, educated by exiles, whose every lesson, whatever its subject, taught the same underlying text, that his father was a holy man, betrayed, that his inheritance had been stolen by traitors, and that his life had one purpose. When the boy was about 13, the Milanese ambassador, a man paid to be unsentimental, wrote a line about him that has chilled readers for 5 centuries. This boy, he reported, though only 13 years of age, already talks of nothing but of cutting off heads or making war, as if he had everything in his hands. Margaret had saved her son's claim. What the claim had done to the child who carried it, the ambassador had just written down. Meanwhile, the man who had taken their place was proving, in London, that winning a throne and filling it are different trades. Edward IV, in his 20s, was a spectacle of a king, huge, charming, splendid, genuinely gifted, and comprehensively pleasure-loving, and beside him, half creator and half partner, stood the man, Europe now called the Kingmaker. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, had put his cousin on the throne with his ships, his fortune, his garrisons, and his enormous public fame, and he expected the reign to run as a partnership, with foreign policy, above all, in his hands. Warwick spent years constructing his masterpiece, a grand marriage alliance with France, personally negotiating with the French king for a royal bride, And in 1464, at the exact moment the design was ripening, Edward let it be known to his council, with some embarrassment, that a bride would not be required. He had been secretly married for months to an English widow named Elizabeth Woodville, a beautiful commoner with 2 sons, and, as the court soon discovered, an enormous tribe of siblings requiring titles, offices, and rich marriages, which they proceeded to absorb at a rate that enraged the old nobility. Warwick had been made a fool of before every court in Europe, and worse followed, the Woodville clan wedging itself between him and the king year by year, until the most powerful subject in England, the man who had unmade one king already, began to sit with his grievances the way York once had, and to reach the same conclusion York had reached. Petitioning did not work. What Warwick did about it escalated through 1469 and 70, with the logic of a man discovering there is no halfway point in treason. First he tried rebellion with a puppet, rising with Edward's own feckless brother Clarence, defeating the royal forces, even holding Edward prisoner for a season, and finding that England would not be governed by an earl holding a captive king, released and reconciled, then implicated again. Warwick and Clarence finally fled to France in 1470. And there, in the summer, the French King Louis XI, the great spider of European diplomacy, proposed the unthinkable, and the unthinkable happened. In the cathedral city of Angers, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the man whose house had bled for York since St. Albans, whose father had been beheaded by Margaret's army after Wakefield, whose sword had done as much as any living man's to destroy her family, knelt before Margaret of Anjou and asked her pardon. The tradition, preserved with relish, is that she kept him on his knees a long time, a quarter of an hour by the count that got repeated, before she raised him. Then the deal was struck and sealed in the oldest currency. Warwick's teenage daughter Anne was betrothed to Prince Edward of Lancaster, the boy who talked of cutting off heads, and the kingmaker swore on a fragment of the true cross to restore the house of Lancaster. And Margaret, who had spent 9 years learning that hatred is a luxury and her son's crown a necessity, swallowed the alliance whole. Enemies in everything but arithmetic. It was the strangest handshake of the century, and for exactly 6 months it worked like a spell. Warwick landed in the west of England that autumn, and the reign of Edward IV fell apart in days. Risings triggering across the map, a trap closing in the north, until the King of England, betrayed on every side and nearly captured in his bed, ran for the coast with a few hundred men and took ship for the Low Countries, so short of everything, the story goes, that he paid the ship's master with the fur-lined coat off his back. In London, men went to the Tower with respectful faces and brought out a thin, bewildered, grey prisoner, and combed him, and dressed him in royal blue, and carried him through the streets to St. Paul's with a crown on his head, and the reign of Henry VI resumed as if by government notice. The readeption, the clerks called it, and every observer who left an account noticed the same thing about the restored king, that he sat amid his own restoration, like a guest at it, milled, absent, thanking his jailers turned courtiers, a sacred relic being processed through ceremonies whose meaning had drained away. He had been a king, then a fugitive, then a prisoner, and was now a king again. And the difference, a Londoner wrote, was hard to see on him. Real power sat with Warwick, uneasily, provisionally, waiting on the Queen, and here the spell met its flaw. And the flaw, one last time, was Margaret's caution, the one commodity she had never before been accused of holding. She did not trust the wind, or the Kingmaker, or England, and who alive had earned that distrust more honestly. She lingered on the French coast with her son and the last army of Lancaster, waiting for perfect weather, perfect assurances. Through the winter, through February, through March, the delay, prudent by every rule she had learned in 10 years of ruin, handed the story its cruelest timing, because across the narrow sea, in Burgundy, the big deposed king with the fur coat had not accepted the arithmetic either, and in March of 1471, with a borrowed fleet and 1,500 men, Edward IV sailed for England, and landed with a poetry nobody could have scripted and everybody noticed, at Ravenspur, the same vanished sandbank harbour where Henry Bolingbroke had come ashore 72 years before to begin this entire story. And, marching inland, he even ran the same play, swearing at first that he came not for the crown, only for his Duchy of York, his father's inheritance. Nothing more. The oath had worked in 1399. It worked in 1471. England let him pass. And the two Edwards, the two futures, began converging on the middle of the kingdom, while the old king prayed in London and the Queen watched the weather off Honfleur, and the House of Lancaster came, at last, to its final month. Barnet was fought blind. On Easter morning, the 14th of April, 1471, a fog lay on the high ground north of London so thick, the accounts agree, that the two armies that had bedded down almost within bowshot of each other in the dark could not see each other at dawn, and the guns and the arrows opened into grey blankness. Edward had reached London first, the city opening to him as it always opened to the stronger tide, and had taken possession of the capital and of the person of Henry VI, and, in a detail that stands for the whole poor man's life, had brought the old king along with the army in the baggage, a sacred object in protective custody, so that Henry spent Easter within earshot of the battle, deciding his own fate, praying in the fog. In that fog, the war turned on an accident of tailoring, the two lines, misaligned in the murk. Each overlapped the other's left, and the fighting wheeled the whole battle sideways like a door on a hinge. And when the Earl of Oxford's victorious Lancastrian wing returned from chasing routed Yorkists off the field, it blundered into the rear of its own centre. In the fog, Oxford's badge, a star with streaming rays, looked to his allies' archers like Edward's badge, a sun with streaming rays. The volleys went into friends, the cry of treason, the one word this war had taught every soldier to believe instantly, tore the Lancastrian line apart from inside. And in the collapse, the Kingmaker, fighting on foot that day to prove to his new allies he would not ride away, ran for the horse park and was caught and killed in the press, stripped, by one account, to his doublet by looters, before his own men knew he was down. Warwick the Kingmaker, the man who had crowned and uncrowned kings of England for 16 years, died in a fog, killed in a rout begun by his own side's arrows, undone by the resemblance between a star and a sun. That same Easter morning, after a winter of waiting for safe weather, Margaret of Anjou and her son finally landed in the West Country. She came ashore at Weymouth to be told, within hours, that the ally she had knelt to nothing for was dead since dawn. The readaptation government was headless, and her cause, 36 hours old on English soil, was already reduced to the army she could gather as she moved. She nearly turned back to the ships, by the reports, and it was her 17-year-old son, bred at Cur for exactly this hour, who would not hear of it. The last campaign of the House of Lancaster became a race. Margaret's army drove north through the West Country, aiming for the River Severn and the crossing into Wales, where allies and recruits waited, and Edward, reading the map the same way, drove parallel and hard to cut her off, and the two armies covered brutal distances through the first days of May, the Lancastrians marching, at the worst of it, something like 40 miles in a day and a night, men fainting in the ranks, to reach the crossing at Gloucester and finding its gates barred on Edward's orders, pushing on, spent, to the next crossing upriver, at an abbey town called Tewkesbury, where, on the 3rd of May, the exhausted army stopped, because it could go no farther, and turned to fight with the river at its back. The battle on the 4th of May lasted the length of a spring morning, and it broke on one man's judgment, the Lancastrian vanguard commander, the Duke of Somerset, last but one of the Beaufort line, whose family had stood and died for this cause at St. Albans. At Hexham, launched a flank attack through the lanes and hedges that briefly promised everything, and Edward's line bent and held, and a small Yorkist cavalry reserve, posted with a professional's foresight in a wood exactly against this chance, came down on Somerset's open flank, and the attack disintegrated. The retreat became flight through ground so choked and channeled, ditches, hedges, streams, that the fields between the battle and the river are still called the Bloody Meadow, the second field in this story to carry that name. And, in the wreck of it, Edward of Lancaster, Prince of Wales, 17 years old, the boy born during his father's silence, the boy who talked of cutting off heads, was killed. Be scrupulous here, because the stories multiplied later and grew crueler with each Tudor retelling. The earliest and most sober accounts say simply that he died in the field, crying, one adds, for rescue to his brother-in-law, Clarence, and was slain. The elaborate scene of his murder, in cold blood, before Edward's face, belongs to later tellings, and no version changes the arithmetic. The House of Lancaster had exactly one heir, and he lay dead in a Gloucestershire meadow at 17, the only Prince of Wales in England's history ever to fall in battle. 2 days later, Somerset and the other leaders who had claimed sanctuary in Tewkesbury Abbey were taken out, tried before the king's brothers in an hour, and beheaded in the marketplace. Margaret was found, within days, hiding at a religious house, her cause dead in the meadow with her son, and was brought to London a prisoner, and carried through the streets in a carriage. The Queen, who had commanded armies for 16 years, displayed to the crowds behind the victor's procession. That procession entered London on the 21st of May. That night, inside the Tower, Henry VI died. The government's announcement, made with a straight face, was that the former king hearing of Tewkesbury, of his son's death and his cause's ruin, had died of pure displeasure and melancholy. Nobody believed it then, and no serious historian believes it now. And you, by this point in the story, are equipped to read the night of the 21st of May with terrible fluency, because you have seen this exact document before. Go back 71 years, to Pontefract, to the winter of 1400, a deposed, anointed king, a locked room in a fortress, a death timed, with perfect convenience, to the extinction of his cause, so that killing him no longer creates a rival but erases the last one. No wound admitted, no order surviving, a body displayed to prove death and silence questions, and a government that finds sorrow a sufficient cause of death in inconvenient kings. Henry Bolingbroke wrote that formula when he starved Richard II, and his house rode it to the throne. And on the night his house's last king lay in the Tower with the dynasty already dead at Tewkesbury, the House of York simply took the formula down off the shelf and executed it, step for step, on its author's heir. When Henry's body was displayed at St. Paul's, the chronicles record that it bled on the pavement, which the age read as accusation, and when his coffin was opened by scholars in 1910, the skull was found broken and matted into the hair. The examiners reported was what appeared to be blood. Displeasure does not crack a skull. The circle that opened at Pontefract closed in the Tower, and it closed on the family that had drawn it. Count what 3 weeks in April and May had taken. Warwick, dead at Barnet. The Prince, dead at Tewkesbury. Somerset, last fighting Beaufort of his line, dead in the Market Square. Henry VI, dead in the Tower, and with his son gone before him, the royal line of Lancaster, the blood of Henry Bolingbroke, of the hero of Agincourt, was extinct. Margaret lived, if it can be called that, 5 years a prisoner in England until the King of France brought her home like a settled account, to die in poverty in 1482, the Queen who had never once stopped fighting, outliving her husband, her son, her cause, and very nearly everyone who had ever fought for or against her. The verdict of the sword, the only verdict this family had ever truly rested on, had been rendered in full, and the House of York stood alone on the field, to Towton, unchallenged, secure. It had, in fact, 14 years, because the House of Lancaster was extinct, and the idea of Lancaster was not and ideas, as this family had learned at such expense from the ghost of Richard II, are harder to starve than men. In a manor house in the West Country, there waited out these years a quiet, watchful boy of 14 with a thread of Beaufort blood in him, the bloodline barred from the throne by a clause written 80 years before, and a mother, small, brilliant, and relentless, who had already begun, in the wreckage of everything, to count what was left. The House of Lancaster died in May of 1471. Then something strange happened, and it started at a tomb. Edward IV had buried his rival quietly, at an out-of-the-way abbey called Chertsey, far from the crowned dead of Westminster, which is exactly what the first Lancaster king had done with Richard II, and it failed in exactly the same way. Within a few years, people were coming to the grave, ordinary people, sick people, frightened people, pilgrims arriving in ones and twos and then in crowds, because a story was moving through England that the murdered king worked miracles. The blind saw at his tomb. The story ran, the drowned revived. A plague-stricken child recovered when her mother measured her body with a thread and vowed it to King Henry. Clerks began writing the cures down, and the collection grew to hundreds of recorded miracles, sworn by witnesses, and pilgrim badges stamped with the dead king's image turn up in English mud to this day, in numbers that rival the great official shrines. The man who had failed at everything a king is measured by had become, in death, the one thing no other English king ever quite became: a folk saint. People prayed to the king who could not govern a Tuesday. And the joke writes itself. And the joke misses the point. Because the pilgrims had not mistaken his weakness for strength. They had recognized his gentleness for what it was. The only innocence anywhere in this whole bloody story. And they knelt to it. The government of Edward IV watched the cult swell until it had to be managed. And the next York king, Richard III, moved the body to Windsor, into splendour beside the royal dead, which only fed the shrine. And to this day, once a year, on the 21st of May, representatives of Eton and of King's College, Cambridge, walk into the Tower of London and lay lilies and roses on the spot where their founder died. The schools he built still send him flowers, 5.5 centuries later, to the room where his family's formula was used on him. No other failed king on earth gets that. The second afterlife was a acquisition, and it was executed by the most patient woman in England. Margaret Beaufort had been a 13-year-old widowed mother when her only child was born, and that child, Henry Tudor, carried in his veins the thread this story planted 80 years ago at Kenilworth, the Beaufort line, John of Gaunt's Children by Catherine Swynford, legitimised by Pope and Parliament, with one clause inserted like a needle, barred from the throne forever. By 1483, the bar hardly mattered, because there was nothing left to inherit. A claim, through an excluded bastard line, through a woman, to a dynasty that no longer existed. Then, the House of York did the one thing that could resurrect Lancaster. It ate itself. Edward IV died at 40. His brother Richard took the throne, and Edward's 2 sons went into the Tower of London and never came out. And England, which had swallowed 60 years of battlefield killing, gagged on the disappearance of 2 children. Margaret Beaufort saw the opening and threaded it, negotiating in secret with the boy's mother, a marriage compact. Her exiled son to wed Elizabeth of York, the vanished prince's sister. The 2 broken claims fused into one. In August 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with borrowed French money and a small army, met Richard III at Bosworth, and won because, one last time in this story, magnates change sides on the field itself. Richard died fighting, the last English king killed in battle, and the crown, the story goes, was retrieved from the battlefield debris and set on Henry's head. Notice what actually crowned him, not the Beaufort thread, which he barely dared argue, the sword, the verdict of the field, the exact title of 1399 and 1461, the family patent working for a 3rd dynasty in a row. And then the marketing began, because Henry VII understood something neither warring house had grasped. He married Elizabeth of York as promised, and his heralds fused her white rose with a red rose for Lancaster, a badge the actual dynasty had barely used, into a single two-coloured flower, the Tudor rose, and the message went out in stone and glass and pageant across the kingdom. The wars were over because the two bloods were now one blood. It was brilliant, and it was retroactive branding, the very phrase the whole conflict wears today. The Wars of the Roses was polished centuries later out of that Tudor emblem. The losing house's memory was not avenged. It was purchased, trademarked, and installed as the founding myth of the new regime. And the gentle dead king was promoted hardest of all, Henry VII petitioning Rome itself to have Henry VI declared a saint, the usurper's great-great-grandson lobbying for a Lancaster halo, because a holy martyred ancestor is the best legitimacy money can buy. The third afterlife is the one you already own, and you may not know how you came to own it. A century after Bosworth, under the Tudor dynasty's last queen, a playwright from Stratford wrote 8 linked plays covering everything you have just watched, from the baton in the dust at Coventry to the field at Bosworth, and those plays became the version, the doubting father on his sleepless throne, the wild prince redeemed into the warrior king, the band of brothers in the rain before Agincourt, the saintly, helpless Henry watching England devour itself, Margaret, the she-wolf of France. Shakespeare was writing under the granddaughter of the man who won at Bosworth, from sources the winners had curated, and the plays are magnificent, and they are not evidence. And for 400 years, the world has struggled to remember the difference. When American paratroopers in Normandy in 1944 were given a name for their brotherhood, it came from a speech no king ever gave, written by a playwright born 150 years after the battle. And when an American novelist sat down in the 1990s to build a fantasy of warring noble houses, he went to these same wars and changed, famously, little more than a vowel, Lancaster to Lannister, York to Stark, and tens of millions of Americans now carry in their heads a version of this exact struggle. The seized throne, the child heir, the kingmaker, the boy king's death, without knowing that under the dragons it is all real, that there are mass graves at Towton with the skulls still in them, and a room in the tower that still gets flowers. One more American inheritance. And this one is not entertainment. The men who built the United States read this century of English history like a case file. They knew the sequence cold. A legal deposition dressed in parliamentary clothes, a disputed succession, and 3 generations of civil war. And when they designed a republic, they were designing against exactly this. Fixed terms, defined succession, impeachment as the lawful road that 1399 never had, power transferred by calendar and ballot instead of by Ravenspur landings. The nightmare in the back of the founders' minds had English accents, and some of it wore a red rose, and in one of history's small courtesies. The road connecting the two worlds runs through a town in Pennsylvania named Lancaster, settled by English colonists carrying the old county name, where the Continental Congress, fleeing the British Army in September of 1777, convened for exactly 1 day, making Lancaster, for 24 hours, the capital of the United States. The name that could not hold England held America for an afternoon. So, end where this story began, in Westminster Hall, before the empty throne, because the hall is still there. The oak angels Richard II paid for still looked down from the roof, and, beneath them, across 6 centuries, England has crowned its banquets and tried its traitors and mourned its dead, and the chair is long gone. But the question that hovered over it that September morning never left the room. Henry Bolingbroke sat down in an empty throne to prove that a crown could be taken by a man wronged enough, strong enough, and popular enough, and his son spent a short, blazing life proving the taking had been blessed, and his grandson knelt and prayed while the proof came apart. And in the end another family walked the same road back at them, landing at the same vanished beach, swearing the same soft oath, and closing the account in the same locked tower with the same quiet method, seized in an autumn, proven in the mud, lost in the snow, erased in a locked room, and then, strangest of all, resurrected as a rose, a scent, and a stage play, until the family that lost everything conquered the one territory no army reaches, which is memory. The House of Lancaster began by demonstrating that no anointed king is safe from a determined man. It ended as the demonstration itself, performed on its own blood, and the world that watched has never again fully believed that any crown, anywhere, is beyond the reach of the strong. That is the inheritance, not the throne, which they held for 62 years, but the question which they set loose forever.